In the spring of 1967, a North Vietnamese soldier somewhere in the jungles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail was preparing for an ambush against an American patrol. His name has been lost to history, but what happened to him that day would become part of one of the most secret and controversial operations of the entire Vietnam War. He had been fighting for 2 years, was experienced and competent, a veteran who had survived numerous engagements. He checked his AK-47 rifle one more time, making sure a round was chambered and ready. His fingers moved automatically through the familiar routine. Magazine inserted firmly, bolt pulled back and released, chambering a round with that distinctive metallic sound that every soldier knows. Safety off. Weapon ready. His unit had recently captured a cache of ammunition from what they thought was a successful raid on a supply depot near the Laotian border. The ammunition looked perfect, factory fresh, properly packaged in the distinctive sealed metal containers that held Soviet or Chinese manufactured cartridges. The head stamps on the brass cases showed the correct markings. Everything about the ammunition appeared exactly as it should. It looked identical to every other batch of 7.62mm cartridges he had used hundreds of times before in 2 years of combat. He settled into his position behind a fallen log, weapon resting on the rotting wood, eyes focused on the trail where the Americans would appear. His breathing was calm and controlled. His hands were steady. He had done this many times before. The waiting was always the hardest part. Waiting in the oppressive heat and humidity of the jungle. Waiting with insects crawling over exposed skin. Waiting with the knowledge that, in moments, the jungle would erupt in violence. When the American patrol appeared, moving cautiously down the trail with proper tactical spacing, he raised his rifle smoothly. His cheek settled against the stock. His eye found the crude sights. He aimed carefully at the lead soldier, a young American carrying an M16 rifle. He took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger just as he had been taught, just as he had done countless times before. But instead of the normal sharp crack of the AK-47 firing and the satisfying recoil as the bullet left the barrel traveling at over 700 meters per second, there was a massive explosion. The rifle detonated in his hands with tremendous violence. The receiver split apart as pressure far beyond design. Limits tore through the metal. The bolt, normally contained by the receiver, was blown backward with incredible velocity directly into his face. The heavy steel component struck his skull with the force of a hammer blow. Shrapnel from the destroyed weapon tore into his chest, arms, and throat. Hot gases seared his hands and face. Blood sprayed from multiple wounds. He was dead before his body hit the ground, before his brain could even process what had happened. One moment he was a skilled soldier, executing a combat action he had performed many times. The next moment he ceased to exist, killed not by enemy fire, but by his own weapon betraying him in the most violent way imaginable. His comrades stared in horror and incomprehension. The American patrol was forgotten for the moment, as they tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Their friend and fellow soldier had just exploded. What had happened? Was it a defective rifle? The weapon had been functioning perfectly for months. Was it bad ammunition? The ammunition had looked fine, had come from what they thought was a reliable source. Some kind of freak accident? Manufacturing defect? They had no framework for understanding what had actually occurred. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the cartridge their friend had just fired had been deliberately manufactured to explode and kill him. They didn't know that hidden among the thousands of rounds in their ammunition supply were dozens more of these death traps, waiting patiently to kill anyone unlucky enough to chamber one. And they certainly didn't know that this was all part of a highly classified American operation with an innocent-sounding name that concealed one of the most ruthless and psychologically devastating sabotage campaigns of the entire Vietnam War. This was Project Eldest Son. Some also knew it by its other code name, Italian Green, though the origin of that designation has never been fully explained and remains obscure even in declassified documents. It was a CIA operation conducted in close cooperation with the United States military, specifically with Army Special Forces and other special operations units. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely terrifying in its execution and implications. American forces would manufacture ammunition that looked absolutely identical to enemy ammunition in every visible way, but was designed to explode catastrophically when used. This sabotaged ammunition would then be covertly inserted into enemy supply lines through dangerous infiltration operations. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers would capture or receive this ammunition through their normal supply chains, having no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They would load it into their weapons following their standard procedures, and when they pulled the trigger expecting their weapon to fire normally, their own rifles would explode with devastating force, killing or maiming them. But Project Eldest Son was about much more than just the physical casualties it caused, though those casualties were real and significant. The real objective, the true genius of the operation, was psychological warfare on a massive and insidious scale. Every time a weapon exploded, it didn't just kill one soldier, it created doubt and fear among everyone who witnessed it or heard about it. Soldiers began to fear their own ammunition, to distrust the very bullets in their magazines. They couldn't be sure which rounds were safe and which were deadly. They started to suspect that their entire supply system had been compromised by American intelligence. They began to wonder if the weapons and ammunition provided by their Chinese and Soviet allies had been infiltrated and sabotaged at the source. The operation was deliberately designed to turn the enemy's logistics system from a source of confidence and strength into a source of terror and uncertainty. This is the story of one of the most secret and controversial operations of the Vietnam War. It's a story about the dark creativity of intelligence agencies when conventional warfare isn't producing desired results, and when pressure exists to find new ways to hurt the enemy. It's a story about the blurred and ambiguous line between legitimate military sabotage and what some would characterize as terrorism or illegal methods of warfare. It's a story about the unintended consequences of psychological warfare operations that can spread beyond their intended targets. And it's a story about the men who planned and executed this operation, the engineers and technicians who manufactured death in the form of bullets that looked normal but were deadly, the special operations soldiers who infiltrated deep into enemy territory to plant booby-trapped ammunition in supply caches, and the intelligence officers who watched from a distance as the enemy's own weapons turned against them. To understand Project Eldest Son fully, we need to understand the context in which it was created, the strategic situation that made such an operation seem not just acceptable, but necessary to American planners. By 1966 and 67, the Vietnam War had been escalating dramatically for several years. The United States had committed hundreds of thousands of troops to South Vietnam in an effort to prevent communist forces from overrunning the country. American forces were conducting major combat operations throughout South Vietnam, engaging North Vietnamese army units and Viet Cong guerrillas in intense fighting. The Air Force and Navy were bombing North Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder, and were also attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia in interdiction operations designed to cut the flow of supplies. Billions of dollars were being spent every month. Thousands of Americans were dying every year. The war was consuming enormous resources and attention, and yet, despite all this effort and sacrifice, the enemy continued to fight effectively. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces continued to launch attacks throughout South Vietnam. They continued to control significant portions of the countryside. They continued to recruit new soldiers and receive supplies from North Vietnam. The American strategy of attrition, the idea that superior American firepower would eventually wear down the enemy and force them to negotiate, wasn't producing the desired results fast enough. Enemy forces seemed able to absorb enormous casualties and keep fighting. One of the most frustrating aspects of the war for American commanders was the enemy's supply system, particularly the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This wasn't actually a single trail, but rather a complex network of roads, paths, waterways, and tracks running from North Vietnam through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The network was extensive, covering thousands of miles, with multiple routes connecting the same points to provide redundancy. The trail was how North Vietnam kept its forces in the south, supplied with everything they needed to continue fighting. Weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, replacement troops, everything. Despite intensive and sustained American bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, despite interdiction efforts that dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, despite all the technology and firepower the United States could bring to bear, the supplies kept flowing south. The North Vietnamese were remarkably resilient and adaptive. When one section of road was destroyed by bombing, they would have it repaired within hours or days, working at night to avoid airstrikes. When a bridge was knocked out, they would build a bypass or construct a ford across the river. When one route became too dangerous due to intensive bombing, they would shift traffic to alternate routes. They moved supplies primarily at night, when American aircraft had more difficulty finding targets. They camouflaged everything meticulously, so that aerial reconnaissance couldn't easily spot supply depots and staging areas. American intelligence agencies were constantly searching for ways to disrupt this supply system more effectively. They tried everything they could think of. They intensified the bombing, flying thousands of sorties against the trail. They tried seeding it with electronic sensors to detect movements and direct airstrikes more accurately, which would eventually become Operation Igloo White. They tried using chemical defoliants to strip away the jungle canopy that concealed the trail, part of the broader Operation Ranch Hand program. They tried inserting ground reconnaissance teams from the Studies and Observations Group to gather intelligence and conduct raids against supply convoys and storage sites. All of these efforts had some effect, inflicting casualties and destroying supplies, but none were decisive. The supplies kept coming. The enemy kept fighting. The war continued. Some creative and unconventional minds in the CIA and military intelligence community began thinking about different approaches, about attacking the problem from a different angle. What if instead of trying to destroy enemy supplies through bombing and interdiction, they could sabotage those supplies in ways that would make them dangerous to the enemy? What if captured or infiltrated ammunition could be made to backfire, literally? What if the enemy's own logistics system could be turned into a weapon against them? What if every bullet became potentially deadly, not to the enemy's targets, but to the enemy soldiers themselves? This kind of unconventional thinking wasn't entirely new in the history of warfare. Sabotage of enemy equipment and supplies has been a feature of conflict for centuries. During World War II, various intelligence agencies had experimented with creative forms of sabotage. The British Special Operations Executive had developed explosive materials disguised as ordinary objects like coal or wood that could be inserted into enemy fuel supplies. The American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, had created numerous sabotage devices and techniques. But what was being contemplated for Vietnam would be sabotage on an unprecedented scale and of an especially critical military supply: ammunition itself. The appeal of ammunition as a sabotage target was obvious to the planners. Ammunition is absolutely essential for military operations. Without ammunition, weapons are useless. Every soldier depends completely on having reliable ammunition. The psychological impact of having ammunition turn deadly would be enormous. Unlike sabotaging fuel or equipment, which might cause operational problems but wouldn't directly kill soldiers, sabotaged ammunition would kill the person using it in a particularly shocking and traumatic way. The fear and uncertainty created would spread rapidly through enemy forces. The technical challenges of creating effectively sabotaged ammunition were significant, but the planners believed they were surmountable with American technological capabilities. The sabotaged ammunition had to look absolutely identical to real enemy ammunition in every visible respect. Any visual difference, no matter how small, would be detected immediately by soldiers who handled ammunition regularly, and the entire operation would be compromised. The sabotaged rounds had to function normally during all handling and loading procedures. They couldn't jam or fail to feed or do anything unusual that would alert the user before the moment of firing, and they had to reliably explode with enough force to destroy the weapon and injure or kill the user when the trigger was pulled. American ordnance experts and CIA technical services personnel began working together to develop the sabotaged ammunition in secure facilities. They obtained samples of ammunition used by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces through various intelligence channels. Most of this was Soviet or Chinese manufactured 7.62 millimeter ammunition for the AK-47 assault rifle, which was the standard infantry weapon for communist forces throughout the war. They also worked on developing sabotaged versions of other types of ordnance, including mortar rounds, rocket-propelled grenades, machine gun ammunition, and other munitions used by enemy forces. The sabotage mechanism was elegantly simple in its basic concept, though complex in its precise execution. A normal rifle cartridge contains a carefully measured amount of gunpowder, typically nitrocellulose-based propellant, that when ignited by the primer, burns rapidly to create gas pressure. This pressure pushes the bullet down the barrel and out of the gun, propelling it toward the target at high velocity. The amount of powder is precisely calculated to create enough pressure to propel the bullet at the desired velocity, typically around 700 to 800 meters per second for an AK-47, while staying within the safe pressure limits that the firearm is designed to handle. For the sabotaged cartridges, the normal powder charge was removed and replaced with a much larger amount of high explosive material. Some versions used several times the normal powder charge. Others used actual military high explosives like composition C4 or similar plastic explosives. When this explosive was detonated by the primer striking the percussion cap, it created far more pressure than the weapon was designed to withstand. The pressure would spike to catastrophic levels that would cause immediate and violent structural failure of the rifle, destroying it and injuring the person holding it. The AK-47 and similar weapons are quite robust and can handle significant overpressure conditions before failing, which is one reason they're so reliable in combat. Soviet weapons were generally designed with generous safety margins, so the explosive charge had to be carefully calculated through extensive testing to ensure complete failure every single time. Too little explosive and the weapon might survive with just some damage, or might bulge or crack without completely failing, which would alert the user that something was wrong with the ammunition. Too much explosive and the cartridge itself might explode or rupture before being fully chambered, which would also tip off the user that the ammunition was defective. The charge had to be precisely calibrated so that when the trigger was pulled and the firing pin struck the primer, the resulting explosion would completely destroy the weapon and cause maximum injury to the user. The teams working on this project experimented extensively to determine the right amount and type of explosive for different weapon systems. They fired sabotage cartridges and AK-47 rifles at test facilities, documenting exactly what happened each time with high-speed cameras, pressure sensors, and careful examination of the failed weapons. They measured the forces involved in the weapon failures. They studied the patterns of weapon destruction to understand how the rifles broke apart under excessive pressure. This testing was dangerous work that had to be conducted in special test facilities with extensive safety precautions to protect the personnel conducting the experiments. The failure modes they observed were horrific and absolutely deadly to anyone holding the weapon. In a typical failure scenario, the cartridge case would rupture violently and the chamber would split open as the metal could no longer contain the pressure. The bolt, which in an AK-47 is a substantial steel component that weighs several ounces and normally travels back and forth in the receiver, would be blown backward with tremendous velocity. In most failure scenarios, the receiver itself would crack or split apart longitudinally as the metal simply couldn't withstand the forces being applied. The magazine would often be blown completely out of the weapon, sometimes fragmenting in the process. Sharp fragments of metal from all these destroyed components would spray in multiple directions. For anyone holding the weapon when this catastrophic failure occurred, the injuries were almost always severe and frequently fatal. The bolt traveling backward at high velocity would strike the shooter's face with enormous kinetic energy, often fracturing the skull, destroying facial bones, or causing massive trauma. Fragments from the split receiver would tear into the hands, forearms, and chest of the shooter. Hot gases under extreme pressure would cause severe burns to any exposed skin. The magazine being blown out could cause additional injuries. The psychological shock of having a weapon violently explode in your hands would be profound, even if somehow the physical injuries weren't immediately fatal. The destruction was so complete and so violent that survival was unlikely, and recovery even for survivors would be a long and difficult process. The sabotaged cartridges also had to function normally in all other ways, except when actually fired. They had to feed reliably from magazines without binding or catching. The AK-47 magazine holds 30 rounds in a curved configuration, and each round has to slide smoothly as the magazine spring pushes them up. They had to chamber smoothly when the bolt moved forward. The cartridge dimensions had to be exact, to tolerances of thousandths of an inch, so there would be no binding or difficulty during the loading process. If a soldier tried to chamber a sabotaged round, and it jammed or felt wrong in any way, They might examine it more closely or discard it, and the sabotage would be discovered. So the cartridges had to be mechanically perfect in every way except for the lethal surprise they contained inside. The exterior appearance of the sabotaged ammunition was absolutely critical to the success of the operation. The brass cartridge case had to have exactly the correct color and finish. Ammunition that has been stored for different periods or in different conditions develops slightly different patinas. The cases had to match typical ammunition of the type being simulated. The head stamp, which are the markings on the base of the cartridge case indicating the manufacturer, year of manufacture, and sometimes lot number, had to be perfect replicas of genuine markings. Chinese. Manufacturers use certain specific fonts, arrangements, and coding systems for their head stamps. Soviet manufacturers use different systems. Each Eastern European country that manufactured ammunition had its own distinctive markings. The American technicians created precise dies that could stamp head stamps that were absolutely indistinguishable from the originals. The bullets themselves also had to look completely correct. Most communist military bullets of this era had steel jackets, sometimes with a thin copper wash, rather than the copper jackets more common in Western ammunition. The steel jackets had a distinctive appearance and magnetic properties. Many communist military bullets also had distinctive lacquer sealant around the case mouth where the bullet was seated and around the primer. This sealant, which was often red, green, or purple depending on the manufacturer and ammunition type, served to waterproof the cartridge and was a visible characteristic that soldiers would notice. The sabotaged ammunition had to replicate all these features precisely. Even the way the bullet was crimped into the case had to match the original manufacturing methods, because experienced soldiers who handled ammunition regularly would notice if something looked unusual. Creating the sabotaged ammunition was therefore a significant manufacturing challenge that required specialized tools, materials, and expertise. It wasn't something that could be done quickly, cheaply, or in large quantities. Each sabotaged cartridge represented significant time, effort, and expense to manufacture. The components had to be sourced or fabricated. The explosive charges had to be precisely measured and loaded. The cartridges had to be assembled with extreme care to ensure they would function as intended. Quality control had to be rigorous because any defective sabotaged round that failed to explode when fired or that appeared suspicious would compromise the operation. At peak production capacity, the classified facilities manufacturing this ammunition might have been producing several thousand sabotaged rounds per month. This sounds like a substantial quantity until you consider that combat units can expend thousands of rounds in a single intense engagement. A battalion conducting sustained operations might use tens of thousands of rounds in a week. The limited production capacity meant that very careful decisions had to be made about how to employ the sabotaged ammunition for maximum effectiveness. Rather than trying to sabotage all enemy ammunition, which would have been physically and economically impossible given the scale of North Vietnamese ammunition use, the strategy was to insert relatively small quantities into the enemy supply system at carefully selected strategic points where it would spread widely through distribution networks and create maximum psychological impact throughout enemy forces. In addition to rifle ammunition, the technical teams also developed sabotage mortar rounds with great attention to detail and lethality. Mortars were crucially important infantry support weapons used extensively by both North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces to provide indirect fire support to their infantry operations. A mortar round is essentially a bomb that is dropped down a smoothbore tube. The round slides down the tube under gravity, and when it hits the firing pin at the bottom, the impact detonates the primer, which ignites the propellant. This creates gas pressure that launches the round out of the tube in a high arc toward the target, where it will explode on impact. A sabotaged mortar round would be designed to detonate immediately when fired, rather than flying downrange to the target. The modifications might involve replacing the standard propellant with a much larger explosive charge, or modifying the fuse so it would detonate the main high explosive warhead immediately upon firing rather than upon impact with the target. When such a sabotaged mortar round was dropped down the tube, instead of launching normally, it would detonate at the bottom of the tube. The explosion would destroy the mortar tube completely, turning it into fragments of deadly shrapnel. More importantly, it would kill the entire mortar crew, typically 3 or 4 soldiers who would be standing immediately around the weapon when it exploded. Mortar rounds were particularly attractive targets for sabotage for several important reasons. First, mortar teams were high-value targets from a military perspective because they provided essential fire support to infantry units. Taking out a mortar team significantly degraded the enemy's combat effectiveness and ability to support their infantry operations. Second, mortars were crew-served weapons, meaning multiple soldiers operated each weapon and stood near it during firing operations. A single sabotaged round could kill multiple soldiers at once, making it more efficient than rifle ammunition that would typically only kill one person. Third, the psychological impact of a mortar exploding catastrophically was enormous on any soldiers who witnessed it, as they would see their comrades literally blown apart by their own weapon. Fourth, mortar ammunition was relatively large and less commonly used than rifle ammunition, which meant that sabotaging even a small percentage of mortar rounds would have a higher probability of being used compared to rifle ammunition, where vast quantities were expended. The technical challenges for sabotaging mortar rounds were somewhat different from rifle ammunition, but equally demanding. Mortar rounds were larger and more complex than rifle cartridges. They consisted of a projectile body containing the high explosive warhead, a fuse mechanism that would detonate the warhead upon impact with the target, tail fins to stabilize the round in flight, and propellant charges that were typically attached to the tail section. The sabotage typically involved modifying the fuse so it would function immediately rather than on impact, or modifying the propellant system to create an immediate detonation rather than a launch. Rocket-propelled grenades, commonly known by the abbreviation RPG, were another important target for the sabotage program. These were shoulder-fired anti-tank and anti-bunker weapons that were widely used by communist forces throughout the war. The RPG consisted of a launcher tube and rocket-propelled grenades that were loaded into the front of the tube and fired by pulling a trigger. A sabotaged RPG round might be designed to detonate immediately when the trigger was pulled, rather than flying downrange to the target, killing the operator and anyone standing nearby. The advantage of sabotaging ammunition for these crew-served weapons was that each incident would typically have multiple victims and would destroy valuable equipment that was much more difficult to replace than individual rifles. The disadvantage was that crew-served weapons ammunition was less common than rifle ammunition and represented a smaller proportion of total ammunition use, which meant fewer opportunities existed to insert sabotaged rounds into the supply system, and less overall impact, even when successful. Once the sabotaged ammunition was manufactured to the exacting standards required, it had to be packaged to look completely authentic. Communist ammunition came in various types of packaging, depending on its country of origin and the specific type of ammunition. Chinese ammunition typically came in sealed tin cans or wooden crates containing several hundred to several thousand rounds, with the containers marked in Chinese characters. Soviet ammunition came in different packaging styles, often using distinctive paper-wrapped packets or cardboard boxes. The specific packaging details varied by manufacturer, time period, and ammunition type. The sabotaged ammunition was placed in packaging that matched the original as closely as possible, with appropriate markings and labels to make it appear authentic. This packaging authenticity was critically important for the insertion operations that would follow. When special operations teams infiltrated enemy supply caches to insert sabotaged ammunition, they needed to be able to remove packages or containers of real ammunition and replace them with packages of sabotaged ammunition quickly and quietly during brief periods of access. If the packaging looked noticeably wrong or different from a typical ammunition packaging, the enemy might notice the discrepancy when they next accessed the cache or when the ammunition was distributed to combat units. Supply personnel who handled ammunition regularly would notice if containers looked unusual, so the packaging had to be convincing not just at a glance, but even under reasonably close inspection by people who were familiar with handling such materials. The technical teams also had to consider very carefully how the sabotaged ammunition would hold up during storage and transport under the harsh jungle conditions of Southeast Asia. Ammunition in Vietnam was routinely exposed to extreme heat, high humidity, heavy tropical rains, and rough handling during transport over difficult terrain. The sabotaged ammunition had to remain fully functional under all these challenging environmental conditions. The explosive charges couldn't degrade or become unstable due to heat or moisture. The brass cases couldn't corrode visibly, as that would make them look different from normal ammunition. The primers had to remain reliable and sensitive enough to function when struck by a firing pin. The packaging had to protect the ammunition from environmental damage. All of this required careful selection of materials, protective coatings, and packaging techniques that would preserve the ammunition in functional condition for extended periods. Extensive testing of the sabotaged ammunition was conducted not just in controlled laboratory conditions, but also in field conditions that simulated the Vietnam environment. Sabotaged rounds were exposed to high heat and humidity for extended periods in environmental chambers that replicated tropical conditions, then test-fired to ensure they still functioned as intended and exploded reliably. The ammunition was subjected to rough handling to ensure the components wouldn't separate or become damaged during transport. The reliability had to be extremely high, approaching 100%, because if sabotaged ammunition failed to explode when fired, it would be recognized as defective ammunition and would likely be examined more carefully, potentially revealing the sabotage and compromising the entire operation. Every round that failed to function as designed represented a risk to the program's continued effectiveness. The men and women who designed and manufactured this ammunition were in a psychologically and morally strange position that some found troubling. They were skilled engineers and technicians doing what they did best, which was solving complex technical problems and creating precisely manufactured items. But the items they were creating were specifically and deliberately designed to kill people in a particularly insidious way by betraying their trust. They were creating ammunition that looked safe and reliable, but was actually deadly. They were, in effect, creating sophisticated booby traps on an industrial scale, manufacturing death disguised as normal military supplies. Some of the personnel involved in these programs later spoke about the psychological impact of the work, the moral complexity of what they were doing. It was one thing to design weapons that soldiers would use in combat against each other, where there was at least some element of equality of risk, and where both sides knew they were engaged in combat. It was something qualitatively different to design ammunition that would kill unsuspecting soldiers who had absolutely no reason to believe they were in danger at the moment they loaded their weapons. These soldiers weren't being killed in combat where they at least had a chance to fight back or take cover. They were being killed by their own weapons betraying them. The work required a certain psychological distance and compartmentalization to avoid dwelling too much on the human consequences of what was being created. The testing phase of the program was particularly psychologically difficult for some of the personnel involved. Watching high-speed film of rifles exploding in the test fixtures, seeing the incredible violence of the destruction, understanding that they were perfecting a method to kill people by betraying their trust in their own weapons, this troubled some of the people involved in the project. But they were working in a highly classified program during wartime. They had security clearances and had signed non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing their work with anyone outside the program. They couldn't talk about their feelings or moral concerns with family members or friends. They had to process their feelings and doubts privately, without external support or perspective. For some, this was manageable. For others, it created internal conflicts that persisted long after the program ended. The scale of ammunition production gives us some sense of the overall scope and ambition of Project Eldest Son. If the classified facilities were producing several thousand sabotaged cartridges per month at peak capacity, and if the operation ran at significant scale for roughly 3 years from late 1967 through 1970, then total production might have been in the range of 100,000 or more sabotaged rifle cartridges, plus many thousands of sabotaged mortar rounds, RPG rounds, and other types of ordnance. This represents a substantial quantity of manufactured sabotage and a significant investment of resources and technical expertise. However, even this quantity was tiny compared to the millions upon millions of rounds of ammunition that North Vietnamese forces used during the same time period. A single division conducting sustained combat operations might expend hundreds of thousands of rounds in a few weeks of intense fighting. The total ammunition usage by all North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces over 3 years ran into the hundreds of millions of rounds at minimum. So even if every single sabotaged round manufactured made it into enemy hands and was eventually used, it would represent a tiny fraction of 1% of total enemy ammunition usage. This limited scale meant the operation could never physically disrupt the enemy's ammunition supply in any meaningful quantitative way. The enemy always had plenty of ammunition. What the operation could do, and what it was actually designed to do, was create pervasive uncertainty about all ammunition. If even 1% of ammunition in a particular supply cache was sabotaged, that meant 99% was perfectly fine and safe to use. But soldiers had no way to know which specific rounds were sabotaged and which were safe. Every round became potentially dangerous. All ammunition became suspect. This was the psychological leverage and amplification effect the operation depended on to have an impact far beyond the relatively small numbers of sabotaged rounds actually produced and distributed. The most dangerous and demanding aspect of Project Eldest Son wasn't the technical challenge of manufacturing sabotaged ammunition, difficult as that was. The truly perilous phase was getting that ammunition into enemy supply caches without being detected, which required special operations teams to infiltrate deep into North Vietnamese controlled territory in Laos, Cambodia, and occasionally even into North Vietnam itself. They had to locate specific enemy supply points based on intelligence that was often imperfect or outdated. They had to covertly access those supply points without triggering alarms or being detected by guards, patrols, or surveillance measures. They had to physically remove real ammunition from the cache and replace it with sabotaged ammunition, a task that took time and created vulnerability. And then they had to exfiltrate back to friendly territory or to a safe landing zone for helicopter extraction, often traveling dozens of miles through hostile jungle, while being hunted by enemy forces who knew someone had infiltrated their territory. These insertion operations were among the most difficult, dangerous, and demanding missions conducted during the entire Vietnam War, testing the skills and courage of America's elite special operations forces to their absolute limits. The primary organization conducting these extraordinarily dangerous insertion operations was the Studies and Observations Group, universally known simply by its acronym SOG, a designation that deliberately obscured the unit's true nature and mission. This was a joint special operations command that reported directly to the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, which was the overall American military command in Vietnam. SOG conducted highly classified reconnaissance and direct action missions, primarily in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, operating in areas that were officially off-limits to American forces under various international agreements and political constraints. SOG's very existence was classified for many years, and its operations were conducted under strict secrecy. SOG was organized into several regional operational commands that divided responsibility for different geographic areas. Command and Control North, designated CCN, operated in the areas adjacent to the demilitarized zone and in northern Laos near North Vietnam. Command and Control Central, or CCC, operated in the dangerous tri-border area where Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam met, an area of heavy enemy activity. Command and Control South, CCS, operated primarily in Cambodia. Each of these commands ran teams into their designated areas on reconnaissance missions, prisoner snatch operations, sabotage missions, and various other covert operations. SOG teams were deliberately kept small for several important operational reasons. A typical team consisted of just 2 to 4 American Special Operations soldiers, usually Green Berets from Army Special Forces, though some Navy SEALs also served with SOG, along with 4 to 8 indigenous personnel. The indigenous component usually consisted of Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands of Vietnam, ethnic Cambodians or Laotians, or occasionally specially vetted South Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers. The Americans provided leadership, specialized technical skills like communications and demolitions, and served as the critical link to American air support and extraction capabilities. The indigenous personnel provided invaluable cultural knowledge, language skills that allowed them to understand enemy communications if they were close enough to overhear conversations, tracking abilities developed from a lifetime in the jungle, and additional manpower for security and carrying equipment. These teams were elite even within the already selective special operations community. The selection process for Americans assigned to SOG was rigorous and demanding. Men had to already be qualified special forces or SEAL operators, meaning they had already passed some of the most demanding training in the military. Then they had to volunteer specifically for SOG duty. Knowing it was extremely dangerous though, often not knowing many details due to classification. They underwent additional specialized training in cross-border operations, survival and evasion in enemy territory, and specific mission skills. The casualty rates for SOG were among the highest of any American units in Vietnam, with some teams experiencing complete turnover of personnel every few months due to killed and wounded. Men volunteered for this duty, knowing the odds were strongly against their survival. A typical Project Eldest Son insertion mission would begin weeks before the actual operation, with intelligence collection and analysis to identify a suitable target. The intelligence might come from various sources that the intelligence community maintained. Photo reconnaissance aircraft flying over Laos and Cambodia would take thousands of images that analysts would study, looking for signs of enemy supply facilities. They would look for trails showing regular traffic patterns, for partially concealed structures that might be supply bunkers, for defensive positions that might indicate something valuable was being protected, for any indicators that supplies were being stored or moved through an area. Signal intelligence teams would intercept and analyze enemy radio communications, looking for references to ammunition movements, storage locations, or supply. Operations. Human intelligence from agents operating behind enemy lines, from defectors who had knowledge of supply operations, or from prisoners who could be interrogated about logistics, would provide additional information. All of this intelligence would be collated, analyzed, and used to build a picture of where ammunition was being stored. Not every ammunition cache identified through intelligence was a suitable target for a Project Eldest Son insertion operation. The target selection process involved careful evaluation of multiple factors. The target had to be significant enough to justify the substantial risk of an insertion operation. A small cache that would supply only one company for a short engagement wasn't worth risking an entire special operations team, and the potential compromise of the program if things went wrong. The target needed to be large enough that its ammunition would be distributed relatively widely throughout enemy forces over time, multiplying the psychological impact. The target also had to be physically accessible to a small team. Some ammunition dumps were so heavily guarded, so deep inside enemy base areas, or in such difficult terrain, that insertion would be essentially suicidal, with no realistic chance of success. The planners had to balance the potential intelligence and operational value of the target against the very real risks to the team and to the continued security of the overall program. Once a target was identified and approved by commanders who understood both the importance of Project Eldest Son and the risks involved, a specific SOG team would be selected for the mission based on their experience, recent operational tempo, and location. The team would begin intensive planning that would consume days or even weeks. The team leader, typically an experienced Special Forces captain or senior sergeant first class with multiple tours and extensive combat experience, would study every piece of available intelligence on the target area with obsessive attention to detail. Maps of various scales would be analyzed to identify approach routes that offered concealment and avoided known enemy positions. Aerial photographs would be studied to understand the terrain, vegetation, and any visible enemy activity. Enemy positions known from intelligence would be plotted. Likely patrol patterns would be estimated. Natural and man-made obstacles would be identified. Alternate routes would be planned in case the primary route proved impassable or compromised. Exfiltration routes back to friendly territory or to potential helicopter landing zones would be carefully mapped out. The team would plan their infiltration with meticulous care, knowing that a single mistake or oversight could result in the mission failing or the team being killed or captured. Most insertions were done by helicopter because that was the fastest way to get deep into enemy territory, and because ground infiltration over such distances would take days and multiply the risks. However, helicopter insertion had its own significant dangers and limitations. The helicopters used were usually UH-1 Huey utility helicopters flown by specialized Army aviation units that had been trained and equipped specifically to support SOG operations. These pilots were among the most skilled and brave in Vietnam. routinely flying into situations that other pilots would refuse. The helicopters would fly carefully planned, low-level routes designed to avoid known enemy anti-aircraft positions. They would use terrain masking extensively, flying through valleys and behind ridgelines to reduce the chance of being seen or heard by the enemy until the last possible moment. The routes would avoid flying over known enemy base areas or positions, if at all possible. The flight would typically be conducted at altitudes of just 50 to 100 feet above the ground or treetops, low enough that the helicopters were flying through the environment rather than above it. At these altitudes, there was zero margin for error and constant risk of collision with terrain or trees. The landing zone itself had to be selected with enormous care, balancing multiple competing factors that often worked against each other. It needed to be close enough to the target that the team wouldn't have to travel too far on foot through enemy territory, because every hour of movement increased the risk of detection, and every mile traveled consumed energy and exposed the team to observation or chance contact with enemy forces. But the landing zone couldn't be so close to the target that the noise of helicopter insertion would alert guards at the supply cache or would draw enemy forces directly to the area where the team would be operating. The landing zone needed to have adequate space for the helicopter to land, or at least to hover, while the team jumped or fast roped out, which meant a clearing or gap in the jungle canopy of at least 60 feet in diameter. And the landing zone needed to be in terrain that provided some natural concealment for the team immediately after insertion, ideally with dense vegetation nearby where they could quickly disappear. Finding landing zones that met all these criteria was often impossible, forcing compromises that created additional risks. Sometimes the only available landing zone was miles from the target, meaning days of movement would be required. Other times the landing zone was very close to enemy positions, meaning the team would be inserted basically on top of the enemy and would have to move immediately while enemy forces were alerted and searching. These operational constraints meant that every insertion was inherently risky, regardless of how careful the planning. The actual moment of helicopter insertion was a time of maximum vulnerability for everyone involved. The helicopters would approach the landing zone fast and low, their turbine engines screaming, rotor blades beating the air with a distinctive sound that could be heard for miles. At the landing zone, they would flare dramatically, the nose of the aircraft coming up sharply, the aircraft decelerating from perhaps 80 or 90 knots to nearly zero in seconds. They would hover just above the ground or actually touch down very briefly. The team would exit as rapidly as possible, either jumping from the skids while the helicopter hovered a few feet up or fast roping down if the landing zone was too confined for the helicopter to get close to the ground. The entire process from arrival to departure might take only 10 to 15 seconds. Speed was essential because every second on the ground was a second the helicopter and team were vulnerable to enemy fire, and a second more noise was broadcasting to enemy forces for miles around that something was happening. As soon as the team was out, the helicopters would depart immediately, pulling up sharply and accelerating away at low altitude, racing back toward the relative safety of controlled airspace. The sound of the helicopters departing would fade into the distance, and suddenly the team would be alone in enemy territory, in hostile jungle, miles from any friendly forces, with the knowledge that enemy soldiers were certainly aware that someone had been inserted and would be searching for them. The sound of helicopter insertion was impossible to conceal or minimize. Those turbine engines and rotor blades created a distinctive and loud signature that could be heard clearly for miles in the jungle, especially at night when ambient noise was lower. Enemy forces throughout the area would hear the helicopters. They would know that someone had been inserted somewhere nearby. They would immediately begin organizing search operations to find and eliminate whoever had been dropped off. This meant the team had only a very short window of time, perhaps an hour or two at most, before enemy forces would begin saturating the area with patrols and search teams. The team's first priority after insertion was to move quickly away from the landing zone into dense concealment, where they could hide and observe while the initial enemy search activity passed over them. Movement through dense jungle at night with heavy loads while trying to remain silent and undetected was extraordinarily difficult and exhausting work. The jungle in Laos and Cambodia was often incredibly thick, with multiple layers of vegetation. The canopy high overhead blocked most moonlight and starlight, creating nearly complete darkness at ground level. Undergrowth consisting of vines, thorns, bushes, and saplings had to be pushed through or carefully moved around. Every movement created some noise and disturbance. Vines would catch on equipment and weapons, requiring careful detachment. Thorns from various plants would tear at uniforms and expose skin. The ground underfoot was treacherous and uneven, covered with roots, fallen logs, leaf litter that concealed holes, and obstacles. Visibility, even with available night vision equipment, was measured in just a few feet. Every single step had to be tested carefully to avoid snapping branches, dislodging rocks, or making other sounds that would betray the team's position. The team would move in single file with careful spacing between members, typically about 5 or 10 meters separating each person. The formation served multiple purposes. Single file was the only practical formation in dense jungle where there was often barely room for one person to pass. The spacing ensured that a single burst of automatic weapons fire or a booby trap wouldn't hit multiple team members. The point man position, usually filled by one of the indigenous personnel who had exceptional jungle craft skills and instincts developed from a lifetime in such terrain, would navigate and watch for obstacles, dangers, and any signs of enemy presence. Behind the point man would come the team leader, navigating with compass and map, checking their progress toward the target, making the critical decisions about routes and tactics. The other team members would follow in the middle, each man watching the person ahead of him in the darkness, keeping visual contact while maintaining enough distance for safety. The rear security man would periodically walk backward, watching the team's back trail for any signs they were being followed or pursued. Progress through difficult jungle terrain at night was painfully slow by the standards of normal walking. A team might cover only a few hundred meters per hour when moving through the densest vegetation or most difficult terrain. A target located 3 or 4 kilometers from the landing zone might take the entire night to reach, with the team moving slowly and carefully, stopping periodically to listen and observe, then moving again. The physical demands were substantial. The team members were carrying heavy loads including weapons, ammunition, radios, batteries, water, rations, specialized equipment for their mission, and the sabotaged ammunition they would be inserting. Total loads of 60 or 70 pounds were typical. Moving through difficult terrain in heat and humidity with these loads was exhausting work. Every 30 minutes or hour, the team would halt for several minutes to listen and observe their surroundings. They would remain absolutely still and silent, ears straining to detect any sounds that might indicate enemy presence. Were there voices in the distance? Could they hear equipment rattling or boots on trails? Was there any indication they had been detected or that enemy forces were nearby? The point man and team leader would confer quietly about whether their route was still good, or if they needed to adjust. After satisfying themselves that they were still undetected and that their route remained viable, they would move forward again into the darkness. As dawn approached after a night of difficult movement, the team would find a hide, position where they could observe the target area, or at least get close enough to finalize their plan for accessing it when darkness fell again. The hide position was absolutely critical to survival and mission success. It had to provide good concealment, ideally in the thickest available vegetation, where even someone walking within a few meters wouldn't see the team unless they literally stumbled over them. It needed to offer some degree of observation capability so the team could watch for approaching enemies and monitor activity around the target if it was visible. And it needed to be defensible, with the team positioned so that if they were discovered and attacked, they could fight back effectively and potentially break contact and escape. In their hide position, which might be used for 12 to 24 hours or even longer depending on the mission timeline, the team would remain absolutely motionless and completely silent throughout daylight hours. They would eat cold rations, consuming only small amounts to avoid creating smells that might carry and alert the enemy to their presence. They wouldn't smoke, even though many soldiers were smokers, and the psychological comfort of a cigarette would be welcome. The smell of tobacco smoke carries a long distance in the jungle and is instantly recognizable. They wouldn't make any unnecessary movement that might shake vegetation or create sounds. They would communicate only through hand signals or by whispering directly into each other's ears, with lips almost touching the ear to ensure the sound didn't carry. They would watch and listen continuously, gathering information about enemy activity patterns in the area around their position and around the target. One or two team members would be actively observing at all times while others rested as much as possible, though rest in these conditions was extremely difficult. The mental stress of knowing that enemy soldiers might be very close by, that detection would likely mean a firefight and probably death or capture, created a constant state of tension that made true rest almost impossible. The physical discomfort of remaining in one position for hours, often crouched or prone, created muscle pain and stiffness. The heat and humidity were oppressive, with temperatures often reaching 90 or 100 degrees and humidity near 100%. Insects including mosquitoes, ants, and leeches were constant torments that had to be endured silently without slapping or scratching. Sleep was fitful at best, more like brief periods of dozing, while remaining alert enough to wake instantly at any sign of danger. As the team observed the target area during daylight, they would be gathering critical intelligence that would inform their final plan for accessing the ammunition cache. How many guards were visible, and what were their patrol patterns and shift change schedules? When did guards change shifts, and did that create any opportunities? Were there regular supply deliveries or other activities that might provide opportunities to access the cache when guards were distracted? What was the exact physical layout of the storage site that they could see, and how did it compare to what intelligence had suggested? Most importantly, was the target actually worth the enormous risk of accessing it, or had intelligence been incorrect about the significance of this location? Sometimes, after all the danger and effort of insertion and movement to a target area, reconnaissance would reveal that the target was not what intelligence had indicated. A site that had looked from aerial photographs like a major ammunition dump might turn out to be mostly empty, or to be storing other types of supplies. In such disappointing but not uncommon situations, the team leader had the authority and discretion to abort the insertion phase of the mission. The risk of accessing an insignificant target wasn't justified, and attempting to do so might compromise the program and waste a dangerous infiltration. The team would observe long enough to gather valuable intelligence about what the site actually was, documenting what they saw for intelligence purposes, then would exfiltrate without conducting the insertion of sabotaged ammunition. But if the target was confirmed as a significant ammunition storage site and appeared to be accessible without suicidal levels of risk, the team would finalize their detailed plan for actually entering the site and inserting the sabotaged ammunition. This was unquestionably the most dangerous phase of the entire operation, the moment when everything could go catastrophically wrong. They would be leaving the relative safety of their concealed position and moving into an area they knew was actively guarded. They would be handling materials and packages that would immediately reveal their presence and purpose if they were detected. They would need time to complete the insertion task, time during which they were completely exposed and vulnerable to discovery. Every second they spent inside the supply cache was a second when everything hung in the balance. The optimal time for accessing the target was typically in the middle of the night, in the darkest hours between midnight and dawn, when guards would be most tired and least alert after hours of monotonous duty. The team would move from their hide position to the target using whatever concealment and approach routes they had identified during their observation period. If guards were present and following predictable patterns, the team would time their approach to minimize the chance of encountering them. If guards had to be passed, the team would have to slip past them silently, moving when the guards were looking away or were at the farthest point of their patrol route. SOG teams had the weapons, skills, and authorization to silently eliminate sentries if absolutely necessary, using suppressed weapons or knives. However, killing guards would immediately alert the enemy that something had happened, when the bodies were discovered or when the guards failed to report in at the expected time. The alarm would be raised and the area would be swarmed with enemy forces searching for whoever had killed their guards. It was far preferable to avoid detection entirely if possible, completing the mission without the enemy ever knowing anyone had been there until weapons started exploding days or weeks later. At the ammunition storage site itself, which might consist of bunkers constructed from logs and earth, natural or artificial caves, or simply supplies stored under camouflage netting in cleared areas, the team would have to gain physical access to the stored ammunition. This typically required opening packaging, removing predetermined quantities of real ammunition, and replacing those rounds with sabotaged ammunition from the supplies the team had carried in. The exact quantities to be inserted would depend on several factors: how much ammunition was present at the site, how much sabotaged ammunition the team had carried, which was limited by weight constraints, how much time the team had before the risk of discovery became too great, and the team leader's judgment about the right ratio of sabotage to real ammunition. The sabotaged ammunition would have been brought on the mission already packaged in containers that matched as closely as possible the packaging used for genuine enemy ammunition. The team would open a crate or sealed tin container of real ammunition, carefully remove a portion of the contents, typically 20 to 50 rounds, and replace them with an equivalent number of sabotaged rounds from their matching packaging. The container would then be resealed carefully to look as though it had never been opened. Any seals or fasteners would be restored to their original condition. Any identifying marks or labels would be preserved. The goal was to leave absolutely no trace that the container had been tampered with. This process would be repeated with multiple containers throughout the storage site to distribute the sabotaged ammunition and increase the probability it would spread through the enemy's supply system. This work had to be done in complete darkness, or with only minimal illumination from hooded flashlights or night vision equipment, because any visible light would immediately attract attention in a hostile area where lights at night were extremely unusual. The team members doing the actual insertion work would be moving as quietly as possible, trying not to make sounds that would alert guards or enemy soldiers who might be in the area. Other team members would be providing security in a perimeter around the work site, watching and listening intently for any indication that the team had been detected. The team leader would be managing the entire operation, making real-time decisions about how much ammunition to insert and when they had been exposed long enough and needed to withdraw before their luck ran out. Time seemed to move strangely during these intense operations. Minutes felt like hours while the team was inside the supply cache actually conducting the insertion. Every sound in the night, every movement of vegetation in the wind, every distant voice or unfamiliar noise created a spike of tension and adrenaline. Was that a guard approaching the area? Was that someone calling an alarm in Vietnamese? Had something been knocked over or moved in a way that would alert the enemy that someone had been here? The stress level was almost unbearable. Every man was in a state of maximum alertness, adrenaline flooding their systems, heart rates elevated, senses stretched to their limits, ready to fight or flee at the first definite sign they had been compromised. Once the predetermined quantity of sabotaged ammunition had been successfully inserted into multiple containers and the storage site had been secured and arranged to conceal any evidence that anyone had been there, the team would withdraw carefully from the immediate target area. They would move back into concealment at a position where they could observe the target site from a distance. If there was sudden increased activity at the site, lights coming on, voices shouting, intensive searching, it would indicate clearly that their presence had been detected. If activity remained normal, with guards continuing their routine patrols and no sign of alarm, it would mean they had successfully completed the insertion without detection. The team would observe for at least several hours to ensure no delayed discovery had occurred. The exfiltration phase, getting out of enemy territory and back to safety, was in some ways even more dangerous than the infiltration had been, because by this point, the team had been in enemy territory for 2 or 3 days. The initial helicopter insertion was known to enemy forces who had heard the helicopters and knew someone had been dropped off somewhere. They would have been searching continuously. The longer the team remained in the area, the greater the cumulative probability that they would be detected by patrols, by chance encounter with enemy forces, or simply by leaving some trace that observant trackers would find. Every additional hour in enemy territory increased the danger. Exfiltration routes would have been planned in advance with multiple options depending on the tactical situation and how the mission had developed. The team might move toward a pre-designated helicopter landing zone, where helicopters would come to extract them. The landing zone would have been selected during planning, with primary and alternate sites identified. At the scheduled extraction time, the team would move to the landing zone and establish security around the perimeter. They would communicate with the extraction helicopters using encrypted radios, providing information about the tactical situation and whether the landing zone appeared. To be clear, or if enemy forces were in the area. The extraction helicopters would approach the area carefully, having been briefed on known enemy anti-aircraft positions and threats. At the designated time, they would come in fast and low toward the landing zone. The team would mark their position using infrared strobes or other signals visible to the helicopter pilots with their night vision equipment, but invisible to enemy forces without such equipment. The helicopters would flare and land or hover briefly. The The team would board as rapidly as possible, climbing onto the skids or being pulled into the cargo bay by the crew chiefs. And then the helicopters would depart immediately, pulling up and accelerating away from the area as fast as possible, trying to get clear before enemy forces could react or bring effective fire against them. These extractions were frequently conducted under fire, especially if enemy forces had tracked the team or had the extraction landing zone under observation. As the helicopters came in to pick up the team, enemy forces in the surrounding jungle would open fire with automatic weapons, trying to shoot down the helicopters or kill team members as they boarded. The helicopters would be taking ground fire while hovering at the landing zone, with enemy bullets striking the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft, ricocheting off metal components, sometimes wounding or killing crew members or hitting critical systems. The door gunners on the helicopters would be returning fire with their machine guns, trying to suppress enemy positions. Team members waiting to board would also be firing at enemy positions. Everyone would be desperate to get aboard and get airborne before the helicopters were shot down, or so badly damaged they couldn't fly. Multiple SOG helicopters were shot down during extraction operations over the years of the program. Crew members were killed. Teams on the ground were sometimes stranded when their extraction helicopters were destroyed, forcing them to move to alternate landing zones and wait for additional helicopters to attempt another extraction, all while being pursued by enemy forces who now knew exactly where they were. Some teams had to fight running battles for hours or even days, moving through the jungle while under pursuit, calling in airstrikes to slow their pursuers, desperately trying to reach alternate extraction points or to survive long enough for rescue. If helicopter extraction wasn't feasible due to weather, enemy anti-aircraft defenses, or the tactical situation, teams might have to exfiltrate overland, moving on foot toward friendly territory. This meant days of extremely difficult and dangerous movement through enemy-controlled areas. They would move primarily at night, when detection was less likely, hiding during daylight hours in the best concealment they could find. They would have to cross rivers and streams, which were often watched by enemy forces who knew these were natural channelization points where infiltrators might be found. They would be carrying limited food and water, surviving on emergency rations and whatever water they could find and purify. And they would be exhausted from days of stress, minimal sleep, and constant movement while carrying heavy loads. The physical demands and toll of these multi-day missions were extreme and left lasting effects on participants. Team members typically lost 10 to 20 pounds during a single mission lasting 5 to 7 days. They would be severely dehydrated despite efforts to maintain water intake, because finding safe water sources and having time to purify water was difficult. They would be covered with insect bites, leeches, cuts, scratches, and often infections from minor wounds that couldn't be properly cleaned and treated in the field. The combination of intense physical exertion, minimal food, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress pushed men to the absolute limits of human endurance and sometimes beyond those limits. The casualty rates for SOG teams conducting these cross-border operations were truly staggering and shocking even by the standards of the Vietnam War, where casualties were heavy throughout. Some specific teams and some specific operational periods experienced casualty rates exceeding 100% over the course of a year, meaning that every original team member was killed or wounded and had to be replaced, and some of the replacements were also killed or wounded during that same year. The life expectancy for personnel assigned to some of the most dangerous SOG missions was sometimes measured in months rather than years. Men volunteered for this duty and continued to serve despite knowing from watching friends die that the odds were very much against their survival. They did it for various reasons. Out of a sense of duty and commitment to the mission, out of loyalty to their teammates who they wouldn't abandon, out of belief in the importance of what they were doing, or simply because they were professional warriors who found meaning and purpose in the intensity of the most dangerous operations imaginable. For Project Eldest Son, mission specifically, the danger was arguably even greater than for typical SOG reconnaissance operations, because the mission profile required accessing fixed enemy installations, rather than simply moving through an area gathering intelligence. The team had to get close to hardened enemy positions where guards were present. They had to spend significant time exposed and vulnerable while actually inserting the ammunition into supply caches. They had less flexibility to avoid contact or to bypass enemy forces because they had a specific target they had to reach and access. All of these factors increased the danger beyond what was already extraordinarily dangerous work. The men conducting these missions were constantly aware that capture during a Project Eldest Son operation would be particularly catastrophic in multiple ways. If captured with sabotaged ammunition in their possession, the enemy would immediately learn about the operation, and the program would be comprehensively compromised. The North Vietnamese would examine their ammunition supplies and remove sabotaged rounds, stopping further casualties. The psychological impact of the program would be reduced. All the investment in developing the sabotaged ammunition and all the risks taken to insert it would be wasted. Moreover, the interrogation of captured team members would likely be extremely brutal, as the enemy tried to learn everything possible about the sabotage program, how widespread it was, what types of ammunition were sabotaged, how to identify sabotaged rounds, who was responsible, what other supplies might be sabotaged. The prospect of such interrogation was terrifying. Additionally, there was a question about whether sabotaging ammunition might be considered illegal or improper under international law, and whether that might affect how prisoners involved in such operations would be treated. Would they be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions? Or might they be treated as saboteurs or terrorists who weren't entitled to such protections? These questions created additional psychological burden on top of the normal fears about capture that all soldiers behind enemy lines experienced. SOG teams carried various means of destroying sensitive materials and equipment if capture appeared imminent. Demolition charges could be used to destroy radios and other equipment that the enemy shouldn't be allowed to capture. Small incendiary devices could be used to burn documents and maps. As an absolute last resort, team members carried weapons and ammunition they could use on themselves rather than be captured, though actually committing suicide to avoid capture was rare in practice. The psychological burden of knowing that capture might mean betraying the mission, enduring torture, spending years in brutal prison camps, and potentially facing trial for war crimes weighed heavily on everyone involved. The indigenous personnel who served on these SOG teams alongside the Americans deserve special recognition and remembrance because their service and sacrifice is often overlooked in American accounts of the war. These men were not Americans. They had no obligation to undertake these incredibly dangerous missions deep into enemy territory. They could have avoided such service or chosen less dangerous assignments. Their pay was modest, especially compared to what American soldiers received. They would receive no recognition or glory because the operations were classified and their role would never be publicly acknowledged. If they were captured by North Vietnamese forces, they could expect absolutely no mercy. The North Vietnamese considered indigenous personnel working for Americans to be traitors deserving of execution, often after brutal interrogation and torture. Their families might also face retaliation. Yet, despite all these factors that argued against service, these men volunteered and served with remarkable courage, skill, and loyalty. Many developed close bonds with the Americans they served with, relationships built on mutual respect and shared danger. These men brought essential skills and capabilities that the Americans simply didn't have: intimate knowledge of the jungle and how to move through it efficiently, ability to read signs and tracks that indicated enemy presence, language skills that allowed them to understand overheard conversations or interrogate prisoners, cultural understanding that helped interpret enemy behavior and intentions. They were not just auxiliary personnel, but were essential and valued members of the teams. Many indigenous personnel were killed on these missions, dying in ambushes, in extraction firefights, or from wounds suffered in combat. Many more were wounded, some seriously, and lived with the physical and psychological effects of their service for the rest of their lives. After the war ended and North Vietnam achieved victory, indigenous personnel who had worked for the Americans faced severe persecution. Many were imprisoned, some were executed. Others fled to refugee camps and eventually resettled in the United States or other countries. Their sacrifice and contribution to operations like Project Eldest Son deserves to be remembered and honored. The pilots and crews of the helicopters that inserted and extracted SOG teams were also taking enormous risks that deserve recognition. These aviators flew deliberately into the most dangerous areas in Southeast Asia, often into known enemy anti-aircraft concentrations. They flew at low altitudes where they were vulnerable to even small arms fire. They hovered at landing zones while taking enemy fire, providing perfect stationary targets for enemy gunners. And they returned again and again to extract teams even when previous helicopters attempting the same extraction had been shot down, knowing they might be next, but refusing to abandon the teams on the ground. The aviation units supporting SOG, particularly those flying the extraction missions, had casualty rates that were comparable to the ground teams they supported. Helicopters were shot down regularly. Crew members were killed or wounded. Aircraft that survived missions often came back riddled with bullet holes, with hydraulic lines severed, with engines damaged, somehow still flying, despite damage that should have brought them down. The bravery and skill of these pilots and crew chiefs was extraordinary and essential to the success of special operations throughout the war. Over the approximately 3 years that Project Eldest Son was active at significant scale from late 1967 through 1970, dozens of insertion operations were successfully conducted by various SOG teams. The exact number remains classified even today, but available information suggests there were at least 30 to 50 major operations specifically dedicated to inserting sabotaged ammunition, plus possibly additional opportunistic insertions when teams were in areas for other missions. Some operations were executed flawlessly, with teams infiltrating undetected, successfully inserting significant quantities of sabotaged ammunition, and exfiltrating without enemy contact. These were the ideal outcomes that all the planning and training aimed to achieve. Other operations went badly wrong through no fault of the teams, victims of bad luck, changing enemy dispositions, or simply the inherent unpredictability of operating in such dangerous conditions. Teams were compromised during movement to targets, triggering intense firefights and desperate escapes. Some teams were ambushed at extraction landing zones, leading to casualties and heroic actions to get wounded men out. A few teams were never successfully recovered, lost during missions that went catastrophically wrong, either killed in action or captured and spending years in brutal prison camps. The cumulative psychological toll on the men who survived multiple insertion missions was severe and long-lasting. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood or widely diagnosed during and immediately after the Vietnam War, but the symptoms were clearly evident in many special operations veterans. Men who had been on numerous cross-border missions displayed classic signs of combat trauma. Chronic sleep disturbances with nightmares about combat experiences, hypervigilance, and exaggerated startle responses that made civilian life difficult. Difficulty connecting emotionally with family and friends, self-medication with alcohol or drugs to numb psychological pain, relationship problems, unemployment due to inability to function in normal work environments. The intensity of the combat, the sustained periods of extreme stress, the loss of close friends and teammates, all created psychological wounds that were as real and debilitating as physical wounds, though less visible and less understood at the time. The operational security surrounding Project Eldest Son missions was maintained through multiple layers of compartmentalization. The teams conducting the insertions knew they were inserting sabotaged ammunition, obviously since they were physically handling it. But they typically didn't know the full scope of Project Eldest Son, how many other teams were conducting similar missions, what the overall strategic objectives were, or details about how the ammunition was manufactured and how the sabotage worked. This compartmentalization meant that if a team was captured and interrogated, they could reveal only what they personally knew, which was limited. They couldn't compromise aspects of the program they had no knowledge of. After returning from missions, teams would be extensively debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to extract every piece of information the team had observed. What was the exact location and layout of the target? How much ammunition was present and what types? What were the security measures, including numbers of guards and their equipment? What enemy activity did they observe in the area? Were there other facilities or installations nearby that might be valuable targets for future operations? All of this information would be carefully documented, analyzed, and used to plan future operations and to assess the overall effectiveness of the program. Interestingly, and somewhat frustratingly for the teams, they wouldn't necessarily know if the sabotaged ammunition they had inserted actually achieved its intended effects. They completed their insertion missions and moved on to the next operation, or to rest and training between missions. They might hear later, through intelligence channels, that weapons explosions had been reported in areas where they had conducted insertions, providing some confirmation that their efforts had succeeded. But direct confirmation of specific results was rare. This lack of feedback was psychologically frustrating for some team members who naturally wanted to know if the incredible risks they were taking were producing tangible results and making a difference in the war. Within the SOG community, there was ongoing informal debate among the operators about whether Project Eldest Son missions were worth the risks being taken. Some operators thought it was a brilliant and innovative use of special operations capabilities, achieving strategic psychological effects through small team missions that would be impossible to achieve through conventional operations. Others questioned whether the results justified the risks, whether the teams and assets could be better employed on other missions like prisoner snatches that produced immediate intelligence value or reconnaissance missions that gathered essential information for conventional forces. Some had personal moral qualms about the nature of the ammunition, sabotage, even while they professionally and expertly executed the missions they were assigned. These debates happened informally among the teams during downtime, but couldn't be raised through official channels because of the highly classified nature of the program. As American strategy in Vietnam shifted in 1970 and 71 toward withdrawal and Vietnamization of the war, turning combat responsibilities over to South Vietnamese forces while American troops went home, the operational tempo of Project Eldest Son gradually decreased. Fewer insertion missions were authorized as resources were redirected to other priorities, and as the overall American presence and activity in Southeast Asia declined. By 1971 and 72, Project Eldest Son was winding down, though some limited operations apparently continued even into the early 1970s. The program that had consumed so much effort and cost, so many lives quietly concluded without any public acknowledgement or recognition. The men who conducted these insertion operations were sworn to secrecy and remained so for decades. They couldn't discuss Project Eldest Son with anyone outside the program, couldn't tell family or friends what they had really been doing during their service in Vietnam, couldn't seek recognition or support for the unique stresses they had endured. This enforced secrecy was an additional burden on top of the normal difficulties Vietnam veterans faced, readjusting to civilian life. Some eventually shared their stories decades later, as aspects of the program were declassified, and as they reached the end of their lives and felt free to finally discuss their experiences. Others took their stories to their graves, never having spoken publicly about their role in one of the Vietnam War's most secret operations. The insertion operations of Project Eldest Son represent some of the most daring and dangerous special operations missions conducted during the entire Vietnam War and rank among the most hazardous missions in the history of American special operations. The men who infiltrated deep into enemy territory to plant death in the form of sabotaged ammunition displayed extraordinary courage, remarkable professional skill, and unwavering dedication under conditions that tested human endurance and courage to the absolute limit. Whether the strategic results of the program justified the human costs is a legitimate question that can be honestly debated. But the valor, sacrifice, and professionalism of the men who risked everything to execute these missions cannot be questioned or diminished. They did their duty as they understood it, under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and they deserve to be remembered and honored for that service. The true genius of Project Eldest Son, the element that made it far more than just a technical exercise in sabotage, was the sophisticated psychological warfare campaign that accompanied and amplified the physical effects of the sabotaged ammunition. Every exploding weapon created ripples of fear and doubt that spread far beyond the immediate casualty, affecting dozens or hundreds of other soldiers who heard about the incident or witnessed it. The operation was designed from its very conception to weaponize uncertainty itself, to turn the enemy's supply system from a source of confidence and strength into a source of terror and suspicion. Understanding how this psychological warfare campaign was waged, how it evolved over time, and how the enemy responded reveals both the creativity and ruthlessness of American psychological operations and the remarkable resilience and adaptability of North Vietnamese forces, who refused to be broken despite this insidious threat. The psychological warfare aspects of Project Eldest Son, operated simultaneously on multiple levels, each reinforcing the others to create a comprehensive assault on enemy, morale, and confidence. At the most immediate and visceral level was the traumatic impact on soldiers who directly witnessed weapons explosions. Try to imagine for a moment being in a combat unit where suddenly, without any warning or explanation, a rifle explodes violently in a fellow soldier's hands. One moment, your comrade is standing next to you, preparing to fire his weapon at enemy positions, performing an action that every soldier has done thousands of times and considers completely routine and safe. The next moment, there's a massive explosion. Your friend is down on the ground, screaming in agony. His face is destroyed, a bloody mass of torn flesh and shattered bone. His hands are mangled stumps. Blood is spraying everywhere, pooling on the ground. The horror of the scene is immediate, shocking, and deeply traumatic in ways that normal combat violence, terrible as it is, somehow isn't quite as disturbing, because in combat, you expect to face enemy fire. For the soldiers who witnessed such catastrophic weapons failures, the psychological impact was profound and created lasting changes in how they thought about and interacted with their weapons and ammunition. They had been conditioned through training and experience to trust their weapons absolutely and without question. A soldier's rifle is his most essential tool for survival in combat. It must work reliably every single time. It must be something you can depend on completely when your life hangs in the balance. The rifle becomes almost an extension of the soldier's own body, something that feels natural and safe in your hands. When that fundamental trust is shattered by seeing a weapon violently explode and kill or maim the person using it, it creates a form of psychological trauma that affects every subsequent interaction with weapons and ammunition. After witnessing even a single weapons explosion caused by sabotaged ammunition, soldiers became hyper-aware and anxious about the possibility that it could happen to them at any moment. The act of loading magazines, which had been an automatic and thoughtless action, became a moment of anxiety and doubt. Which rounds are safe? Which ones might explode? There's no way to tell by looking at them. Chambering a round into the rifle created a flash of fear. Is this the round that will kill me? Pulling the trigger brought a split second of tension and dread, wondering if this squeeze of the trigger would result in the rifle firing normally or exploding catastrophically. This constant low-level anxiety and fear was psychologically exhausting. It degraded combat effectiveness by creating hesitation and doubt at moments when decisiveness, speed, and commitment were absolutely critical to survival and mission success. The fear and uncertainty spread far beyond those who had directly witnessed explosions through the powerful mechanism of storytelling and rumor. Stories of weapons exploding circulated rapidly through military units and were passed along to other units through the informal communication networks that always exist in military organizations. Soldiers talk to each other. They share experiences and warnings. When something as shocking and terrifying as rifles exploding happens, it becomes a major topic of conversation and concern. The accounts of weapons failures were often embellished or distorted in the retelling, which paradoxically actually amplified their psychological impact rather than diminishing it. A soldier who heard a third-hand or fourth-hand account of a weapon exploding might imagine the danger was even greater and more widespread than it actually was. The human imagination, especially when fueled by fear and incomplete information, tends to assume the worst. The uncertainty and lack of reliable information about the true scale and nature of the threat made it more frightening rather than less. Unit cohesion and the relationship between soldiers and their commanders was negatively affected by the ammunition sabotage issue. Soldiers began to question among themselves whether their unit was being supplied with safe ammunition or whether their supplies had been compromised. They wondered whether their commanders knew about the ammunition problem and weren't telling them the full truth, creating suspicion about the honesty and trustworthiness of their leaders. Some units experienced actual morale problems and breakdowns in discipline, as soldiers openly refused to use captured ammunition, even when their regular supplies were running low, and commanders were ordering them to use whatever ammunition was available. Others saw tension and conflict develop between enlisted troops who were afraid of the ammunition and officers who tried to downplay the danger or insisted the problem was exaggerated. The American psychological warfare apparatus, the extensive network of organizations and personnel dedicated to influencing enemy thinking and behavior, worked systematically and deliberately to amplify all these psychological effects and spread fear about ammunition. Sabotage as widely as possible through enemy forces. The Joint United States Public Affairs Office, universally known by its acronym JUSPOW, coordinated psychological operations throughout Vietnam and had responsibility for developing and disseminating propaganda materials. They developed sophisticated propaganda campaigns specifically designed to exploit fears about ammunition, sabotage, and to maximize the psychological impact of Project Eldest Son. Leaflets were designed with careful attention to psychological principles and were distributed by the millions throughout areas controlled by or contested with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. These weren't crude or obvious propaganda, but rather sophisticated psychological warfare materials designed by experts who understood how to effectively influence thinking and behavior. Some versions of the leaflets described actual, real incidents where weapons had exploded and soldiers had been killed or wounded. Incidents that North Vietnamese soldiers would recognize as genuine events that had actually happened. This grounding in verifiable reality gave enormous credibility to the propaganda and made soldiers more likely to believe and be influenced by it. The leaflets would then claim that the ammunition sabotage was extremely widespread, much more extensive than it actually was, and that any ammunition could potentially be dangerous. Some versions blamed Chinese or Soviet manufacturers for the ammunition problems, deliberately suggesting that their communist allies were providing defective supplies, with the goal of creating suspicion and undermining those critical alliance relationships that North Vietnam depended on. Other leaflets took a different psychological approach that was in some ways even more insidious. They would openly acknowledge that the ammunition sabotage was being conducted by American forces as a deliberate military operation. They would describe it as a new and highly effective weapon that North Vietnamese soldiers had absolutely no defense against and couldn't protect themselves from. The message being conveyed was clear and terrifying. The Americans could kill North Vietnamese soldiers even without facing them in direct combat, simply by corrupting their ammunition supply in ways that were invisible and undetectable. This propaganda was carefully designed to create a sense of helplessness and vulnerability, to make enemy soldiers feel they were at risk even when not in combat, that they couldn't even trust the basic tools of their profession. Audio propaganda was also extensively used to spread fear about ammunition sabotage. Loudspeakers positioned at American and South Vietnamese fire support bases would broadcast messages in Vietnamese, warning about sabotaged ammunition, and describing in graphic detail what happened when weapons exploded. Aircraft equipped with powerful loudspeaker systems would fly over enemy-controlled areas broadcasting similar messages. Radio broadcasts on frequencies known to be monitored by enemy forces would discuss weapons explosions and suggest the scale of the sabotage problem was much larger than it actually was. All of this audio propaganda aimed to create the impression that ammunition sabotage was ubiquitous, that it was a constant threat every soldier faced, and that there was no reliable way to protect yourself from it. The propaganda campaign had to navigate a delicate balance that required sophisticated psychological operations expertise. It needed to create maximum fear and doubt about ammunition safety without providing so much specific and detailed information that it would actually help the enemy develop effective countermeasures against the sabotage. The messages emphasized repeatedly that ammunition was sabotaged and that weapons would explode, but they deliberately didn't explain exactly how the sabotage was accomplished or provide technical details that would allow enemy ordnance experts to inspect ammunition for signs of tampering. The propaganda aimed to maximize psychological impact, while minimizing the risk of compromising the technical aspects of the operation that made it effective. The North Vietnamese response to Project Eldest Son evolved through several distinct phases over time as they learned more about the program and developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. Initially, when weapons first began exploding in late 1967 and early 1968, the North Vietnamese military leadership didn't understand what was happening and had no framework for explaining these mysterious and disturbing incidents. The initial reports from units experiencing weapons explosions were treated as isolated accidents or as quality control problems with ammunition manufactured by their Chinese and Soviet allies. Reports describing weapons failures were forwarded up the chain of command, but without any clear understanding of what was causing the problem or how widespread it was. As more and more incidents occurred across different units and different geographic areas, and as reports continued to accumulate at higher headquarters, North Vietnamese intelligence analysts began to suspect that something more systematic was happening than just random manufacturing defects or accidents. By early 1968, probably within a few months of the first weapons explosions, they had concluded with reasonable certainty that American forces were somehow deliberately sabotaging ammunition supplies. They issued warnings to their units throughout the theater to be extremely cautious with captured ammunition, and with any ammunition whose provenance wasn't completely certain and documented. They began trying to implement inspection and testing procedures to identify sabotaged ammunition before it could be issued to combat troops and cause casualties. But at this stage, they still didn't fully understand the scope and scale of the operation, or exactly how the Americans were managing to insert sabotaged ammunition into what were supposed to be secure supply chains. The North Vietnamese military newspaper Quan Doi Nhan Dan, which translates to People's Army, and was the official publication of the North Vietnamese military establishment, published several articles in mid to late 1968 that directly addressed the ammunition sabotage issue and warned soldiers to be vigilant. The very fact that the problem was being discussed in official publications indicated it had become significant enough to require an institutional response and public acknowledgement. The articles took a careful tone that acknowledged the sabotage was real and was causing some casualties, but they tried to minimize the psychological impact by claiming it was affecting only a small percentage of ammunition and that proper vigilance and careful inspection procedures would protect soldiers from the danger. The propaganda emphasized that soldiers should not panic or become paralyzed by fear, but should instead follow proper procedures and continue fighting effectively. By late 1968 and into 1969, North Vietnamese intelligence had developed a reasonably complete and accurate understanding of Project Eldest Son, based on captured documents, interrogation of prisoners who had some knowledge of the program, technical analysis of captured sabotaged ammunition that hadn't exploded, and careful observation of patterns in how and where ammunition was being compromised. They understood that American Special Operations Forces were infiltrating supply areas and inserting sabotaged ammunition into caches and storage facilities. They knew the sabotaged ammunition looked absolutely identical to real ammunition and couldn't be reliably distinguished by visual inspection. They knew that testing and inspection could identify some sabotaged rounds, but not all of them, because of the low percentages of sabotaged ammunition mixed in with much larger quantities of real ammunition. Armed with this understanding, they began implementing more systematic and comprehensive countermeasures designed to reduce the impact of the sabotage program. One major countermeasure was to establish strict procedures for segregating captured ammunition from ammunition received directly from North Vietnam through secure supply routes. The theory underlying this approach was that ammunition coming directly from North Vietnam through supply lines that were under continuous North Vietnamese control was less likely to have been compromised than ammunition captured from South Vietnamese government forces or found in positions that Americans might have accessed. Captured ammunition was supposed to be carefully segregated, marked, and subjected to more intensive testing before being issued to combat units for actual use. In practice, implementing this policy was extremely difficult in the chaos of combat operations, and with supply lines that were frequently disrupted by American interdiction efforts. Ammunition from different sources inevitably got mixed together during transport and distribution. The segregation procedures were only partially effective at best. Another countermeasure, one that consumed significant resources and had real operational costs, was mandatory test firing of ammunition before issuing it to combat troops. Units were ordered to take samples from each batch or lot of ammunition and fire them to verify they functioned properly and didn't explode. This procedure did successfully identify and remove some sabotaged ammunition from the supply system before it could cause casualties, so it wasn't entirely ineffective. But it had significant limitations and costs. First, with only a small percentage of ammunition being sabotaged, test firing small samples might easily miss the sabotaged rounds just by chance. Second, test firing consumed ammunition that could have been used in combat operations, effectively wasting scarce supplies. Third, the testing process took time and required personnel and facilities, diverting resources from other military activities. The North Vietnamese also significantly increased security around ammunition storage facilities and supply points in an attempt to prevent American infiltration and insertion of sabotaged ammunition. More guards were posted at supply dumps and storage areas. Patrol frequency was increased in areas surrounding critical logistics facilities. Defensive positions were improved with better fields of fire and more robust fortifications. Attempts were made to make storage sites more secure against small team infiltration through various security measures. These enhanced security measures probably did successfully prevent some American insertion operations or made them more difficult and dangerous to execute. But SOG teams were highly skilled at infiltration and reconnaissance, and many operations continued to succeed despite the improved enemy security posture. Perhaps the most effective North Vietnamese countermeasure from a strategic perspective, though it's difficult to measure with precision, was their philosophical and cultural approach to the problem. North Vietnamese military culture, heavily influenced by revolutionary ideology and by decades of warfare against French colonial forces and then against Americans, placed enormous emphasis on endurance of hardship, acceptance of casualties as necessary costs of revolutionary struggle, and refusal to be broken by adversity, no matter how severe. Officers would acknowledge openly to their troops that some percentage of their ammunition was sabotaged by the Americans, and that some soldiers would inevitably be killed or wounded by exploding weapons. But they deliberately framed this as just another hazard of war, no different in fundamental principle from the dangers of enemy artillery fire, air strikes, mines, booby traps, or any of the countless other threats that soldiers faced every day in combat. Soldiers were expected to acknowledge the risk, take reasonable precautions, but then accept whatever happened and continue fighting with determination and discipline regardless of the dangers they faced. This philosophical approach of acceptance combined with determination helped significantly to mitigate the psychological impact that Project Eldest Son was designed to create. If casualties from sabotaged ammunition were treated as unfortunate but unavoidable facts of war rather than as terrifying and mysterious threats that soldiers had no defense against, it reduced the paralyzing fear and hesitation that the Americans hoped to create. North Vietnamese propaganda directed at their own troops deliberately reframed the ammunition sabotage as evidence that Americans were resorting to underhanded and desperate tactics because they were losing the war through conventional military operations. Enduring and overcoming the ammunition sabotage was portrayed as a test of revolutionary will and determination, another challenge to be met and defeated through the superior morale and commitment of North Vietnamese soldiers fighting for their country's reunification and independence. The North Vietnamese also attempted to use their knowledge of Project Eldest Son for counter-propaganda purposes directed at international opinion and at American domestic audiences. They condemned the ammunition sabotage as an illegal and immoral method of warfare that violated international humanitarian law and the accepted rules of armed conflict. They compared it explicitly to poison weapons and other prohibited tactics that the international community had banned through various treaties and conventions. They claimed that American use of ammunition sabotage demonstrated the barbaric and desperate nature of the American war effort, and showed that the United States had no moral standing to criticize others for their conduct of warfare. This counter-propaganda was aimed partly at international opinion, trying to damage America's reputation and moral standing in the world, and partly at American domestic audiences, hoping to add to growing anti-war sentiment in the United States by highlighting controversial tactics being used in Vietnam. Whether this North Vietnamese counter-propaganda campaign achieved significant results is highly debatable and difficult to assess. Project Eldest Son remained highly classified and was virtually unknown to the American public and to international observers during the period when it was actively being conducted. The incidents of weapons exploding among North Vietnamese forces were not widely reported in international media. Most observers who heard about such incidents attributed them to accidents or to defective ammunition from communist suppliers rather than to deliberate American sabotage. So, the North Vietnamese claims about American ammunition. Sabotage weren't widely believed, reported, or taken seriously during the war itself. The counter-propaganda probably had limited impact on international or American domestic opinion during the period when it might have mattered operationally. The relationship between North Vietnam and its crucial communist allies, particularly China and the Soviet Union, who were providing the vast majority of military equipment and supplies, was affected by Project Eldest Son in complex ways that had both positive and negative dimensions from the American perspective. Initially, during the first few months of the program, when the cause of weapons explosions wasn't understood, there was considerable tension between North Vietnam and its suppliers. The North Vietnamese were experiencing weapons failures and casualties, and their natural assumption was that the ammunition they were receiving from China and the Soviet Union was defective due to poor quality control or manufacturing problems. They demanded explanations and improvements. The Chinese and Soviets insisted somewhat defensively that their ammunition manufacturing was sound and properly controlled, and they suggested that the problems must be due to improper storage, handling, or maintenance by North Vietnamese forces. These mutual recriminations and accusations created exactly the kind of tension and suspicion in the alliance relationships that American planners had hoped to generate. However, when it became clear through intelligence analysis and technical examination of captured sabotaged ammunition that the weapons failures were due to deliberate American sabotage rather than to manufacturing defects, this should logically have reduced the tensions between North Vietnam and its suppliers by providing an external explanation that didn't blame anyone in the Communist alliance. But suspicion and doubt, once planted, tend to linger even after supposedly being resolved. The North Vietnamese couldn't be entirely certain that all of the ammunition problems they were experiencing were actually due to American sabotage. What if some of them really were manufacturing defects that were now being conveniently blamed on sabotage? How could they be completely sure that American intelligence hadn't somehow managed to infiltrate ammunition factories in China or the Soviet Union and was sabotaging ammunition at the source? These lingering doubts and suspicions probably did some damage to the trust and confidence in alliance relationships, though measuring the extent of that damage is essentially impossible from available evidence. The Chinese and Soviet governments and military establishments were genuinely concerned about the security implications revealed by Project Eldest Son. If American intelligence and special operations forces could successfully infiltrate ammunition supplies destined for North Vietnam and insert sabotaged rounds, what did that mean for the security of their own ammunition supplies and for supplies going to other allied countries and revolutionary movements around the world? This concern led to measurably improved security around ammunition, manufacturing facilities, and shipping operations in both China and the Soviet Union. It led to more careful tracking and documentation of ammunition lots and shipments so that problems could be traced back to their origins. It led to enhanced quality control and inspection procedures. In this sense, Project Eldest Son actually improved communist ammunition security practices, which could be seen as an unintended consequence that partially undermined the operation's objectives. The effectiveness of the psychological warfare dimensions of Project Eldest Son, the degree to which it actually achieved its intended objectives of degrading enemy morale and combat effectiveness, is extraordinarily difficult to measure with any precision or confidence. How do you quantify fear? How do you measure the cumulative impact of constant low-level anxiety on soldiers' decision-making and performance? How do you assess whether hesitation caused by doubts about ammunition led to missed opportunities or reduced aggressiveness in combat? There were no reliable metrics or measurements for these psychological phenomena. American intelligence tried to assess the impact through various indirect means, including prisoner interrogations, analysis of captured documents, and reports from agents and defectors who had contact with North Vietnamese forces. Prisoner interrogations of captured North Vietnamese soldiers provided some valuable insights into how enemy forces were thinking about and responding to the ammunition sabotage threat. Many prisoners confirmed when questioned that they were aware of weapons exploding and that it created genuine fear and anxiety among troops. Some prisoners reported that soldiers in their units had been killed or wounded by exploding weapons, providing confirmation that the sabotaged ammunition was actually being used and causing casualties. Others stated that they personally avoided using captured ammunition whenever possible because of fear that it might be sabotaged, even when their units were running low on supplies and officers were ordering them to use whatever ammunition was available. These prisoner accounts suggested strongly that the psychological impact was real, significant, and affecting behavior and decision-making at the individual soldier level. Captured North Vietnamese documents occasionally contained references to ammunition, problems, and weapons malfunctions that provided additional evidence of impact. After-action reports from North Vietnamese units sometimes mentioned weapons that had failed or malfunctioned during engagements, though without always specifying whether these were attributed to sabotage or to other causes. Logistics reports and directives discussed ammunition handling procedures that were explicitly designed to mitigate sabotage risks, including the testing and segregation procedures described earlier. The mere existence of these documented procedures and the time and attention devoted to them in official documents indicated that the ammunition sabotage issue had become significant enough to affect doctrine, training, and standard operating procedures throughout North Vietnamese forces. Agent reports from human intelligence sources who had access to North Vietnamese forces or installations provided additional information about awareness of and concern about ammunition sabotage. These reports always had to be treated with appropriate skepticism, because agents sometimes provided information their handlers wanted to hear, rather than information that was fully accurate. But the volume and consistency of reporting about ammunition concerns suggested there was real substance to the issue. Some agent reports claimed that soldiers were openly refusing to use certain types or batches of ammunition that were suspected of being compromised. Others reported that units were experiencing morale problems related to fears about sabotage supplies. Still others provided details about security measures being implemented around supply facilities, specifically to prevent infiltration and sabotage. Synthesizing all of this intelligence from multiple sources, American intelligence analysts concluded with reasonable confidence that Project Eldest Son was having significant psychological effects on enemy forces throughout the theater of operations. The trust and confidence that North Vietnamese soldiers had in their ammunition had been measurably undermined. Fear of weapons exploding was creating hesitation, doubt, and anxiety that affected behavior. Significant time and resources were being consumed in testing, inspecting, and implementing security measures around ammunition supplies. The enemy's logistics system, which should have been a source of strength and confidence, had been turned into a source of anxiety and concern. These were all intended objectives of the program, and the intelligence suggested they were being achieved to a meaningful degree. However, the intelligence analysts also had to acknowledge and report that the psychological effects, while real and measurable, were not proving to be strategically decisive or war-winning. North Vietnamese forces were continuing to fight effectively despite their concerns about ammunition. They were continuing to conduct military operations, to launch attacks against American and South Vietnamese forces, to hold territory, and to maintain their overall strategic posture. The ammunition sabotage was creating problems and burdens for them, certainly, but it wasn't breaking their will to fight or causing fundamental collapse of their military capabilities. The enemy had adapted to the threat and was functioning despite it, perhaps not quite as efficiently or confidently as before, but still effectively enough to continue prosecuting the war. This gap between tactical success and strategic impact raised important questions that were debated within American military and intelligence circles about the ultimate value and cost-effectiveness of Project Eldest Son. If the goal was simply to create psychological pressure and impose additional burdens on enemy forces, then the program could be considered successful because it was clearly achieving those limited objectives. But if the goal was to significantly degrade enemy combat effectiveness, or to contribute in a major way to winning the war, then the results were much more ambiguous and questionable. The program was consuming substantial resources, including the time and lives of special operations personnel, the manufacturing costs of sabotaged ammunition, and the intelligence assets devoted to targeting and assessment. Whether the return on this investment was adequate to justify the costs was a legitimate question that thoughtful people could disagree about. Some critics within the American military and intelligence establishment argued that the resources devoted to Project Eldest Son could have been more productively used for other programs and operations. The SOG teams conducting insertion missions were some of America's most capable and valuable special operations forces. They could have been used for numerous other high-value missions, including prisoner snatch operations that produced immediate intelligence value, reconnaissance missions that gathered critical information for planning conventional operations, direct action missions against high-value targets like enemy commanders or facilities. The intelligence assets devoted to tracking enemy supply systems and planning insertion operations could have been directed at other intelligence collection priorities. The psychological warfare resources and propaganda efforts could have been used to support other themes and campaigns. The opportunity costs of Project Eldest Son needed to be weighed against its actual achievements. Defenders of the program within the policy and operational communities countered these criticisms by arguing that even limited success in psychological warfare and in imposing burdens on enemy forces was valuable and worthwhile. Modern warfare is fundamentally a competition in which each side tries to impose costs on the other while preserving their own capabilities and resources. Any action that creates additional burdens for the enemy, that makes them less efficient in their operations, that forces them to waste time and ammunition on defensive measures, contributes to the cumulative wear and tear that over time can degrade overall enemy effectiveness. War is not decided by single decisive actions in most cases, but rather by the accumulation of many small advantages and disadvantages that eventually tip the balance. Project Eldest Son, while not decisive on its own, was part of this larger cumulative campaign of imposing costs and creating problems for enemy forces. The debate about effectiveness and value was never fully or definitively resolved because the metrics and evidence for making such assessments were inherently ambiguous and incomplete. We know with certainty that weapons exploded and killed North Vietnamese soldiers. We know with confidence that the enemy took the threat seriously enough to implement extensive countermeasures and issue warnings throughout their forces. We know that individual soldiers and some units were psychologically affected by fears about ammunition safety, but we simply cannot know with certainty or precision what the cumulative strategic effect was on enemy combat capability, or on the overall course and outcome of the war. The impact may have been significant, or it may have been marginal. Different analysts looking at the same incomplete evidence could reach different reasonable conclusions. One significant unintended consequence of the psychological warfare campaign around Project Eldest Son was that it may have created more generalized suspicion about all captured enemy supplies, extending well beyond just ammunition. North Vietnamese forces became suspicious and cautious not just about ammunition, but about other captured materials as well. Medical supplies captured from South Vietnamese forces became suspect, because who knew if they had been tampered with or poisoned? Food supplies were treated with suspicion. Equipment and weapons might be booby-trapped or sabotaged. This generalized paranoia about captured materials, which extended beyond the actual scope of American sabotage programs, could be viewed as a success of the psychological warfare campaign, in that it created doubt and suspicion that affected enemy operations broadly. But it also meant that the enemy became more conservative and careful in how they used captured supplies, which may have made them less vulnerable to future exploitation and sabotage operations. Project Eldest Son officially wound down in the early 1970s as American military involvement in Vietnam decreased substantially and strategic priorities shifted dramatically away from offensive operations and toward withdrawal of American forces. The last insertion operations specifically dedicated to placing sabotaged ammunition into enemy supply caches were conducted sometime around 1970 or 1971, though the exact timing remains classified even today. The manufacturing of sabotaged ammunition at the classified facilities in the United States ceased. The special operations teams that had been conducting these extraordinarily dangerous missions were reassigned to other operations or rotated back to the United States. The propaganda campaigns specifically related to ammunition sabotage were gradually wound down and eventually ended. The program that had cost millions of dollars had involved hundreds of military and intelligence personnel and had killed or wounded an unknown but certainly substantial number of enemy soldiers quietly concluded without any public fanfare, acknowledgement, or recognition of what had been accomplished. For decades afterward, Project Eldest Son remained one of the most closely guarded and successfully protected secrets of the entire Vietnam War. The personnel who had been involved in any aspect of the program, whether as planners, manufacturers, special operations forces conducting insertions, or intelligence analysts assessing results, were bound by security oaths and non-disclosure agreements that they took very seriously. The operations were classified at the very highest levels of secrecy with strict compartmentalization. Very little information about the program leaked out into public knowledge during the war, or in the immediate years afterward. Even most veterans who had served in Vietnam in conventional military units had absolutely no idea that such a program had existed. The few vague references that occasionally appeared in books or magazine articles about the Vietnam War were based primarily on rumors and speculation rather than on actual knowledge, and they were often significantly inaccurate in their details. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s, roughly 25 to 30 years after the end of the war, as documents began to be systematically declassified under various government information programs, and as participants reached the end of their lives and felt increasingly free to share their stories with historians and researchers, that substantial details of Project Eldest Son began to emerge into public knowledge. Even then, and even today, more than 50 years after the events occurred, much information remains officially classified. The exact number of insertion operations conducted, the precise total quantities of sabotaged ammunition manufactured and deployed, the specific casualty figures broken down by weapon type and time period, the detailed technical specifications of how the sabotage was accomplished. Many of these details remain protected from public disclosure under classification rules that apparently still apply. What we know now from the combination of declassified documents, participant interviews and memoirs, and careful historical research allows us to assess Project Eldest Son from multiple important perspectives, including its operational successes and failures, its strategic impact on the course of the war, its ethical and legal implications under domestic and international law, its influence on subsequent special operations doctrine and practice, and its proper place in the broader history of the Vietnam War and of American covert operations more generally. From a purely operational and technical perspective, Project Eldest Son must be judged as a qualified but genuine success in achieving its stated operational objectives. The technical challenge of creating sabotaged ammunition that was absolutely indistinguishable from genuine enemy ammunition in all visible characteristics and that would reliably explode with lethal force when fired was successfully solved by American ordnance experts and CIA technical services personnel. The operational challenge of inserting that sabotaged ammunition into enemy supply systems without detection or compromise was accomplished successfully on numerous occasions by exceptionally skilled and courageous special operations teams. The program functioned largely as it had been designed to function. Sabotaged ammunition was successfully manufactured in substantial quantities. It was successfully introduced into enemy supply lines through difficult and dangerous infiltration operations. It was used by enemy forces who had no idea it was sabotaged. Weapons exploded catastrophically when the sabotaged ammunition was fired. Enemy soldiers were killed and wounded in significant numbers. The operation maintained its security and was never fully compromised during its active operational phase, which is a remarkable achievement for a program that ran for several years and involved hundreds of people. The Special Operations Forces, primarily SOG teams, that conducted the extraordinarily dangerous insertion operations performed with exceptional skill, courage, and professionalism under some of the most difficult and dangerous circumstances imaginable. Despite facing enormous dangers, including operating deep in enemy territory, accessing heavily guarded supply facilities, and exfiltrating through areas saturated with enemy forces searching for them, these teams successfully completed numerous missions. The casualty rates for these operations, while certainly significant and painful, were not catastrophically higher than casualty rates for other types of SOG missions, which suggests that the operational planning and execution were sound. The pilots and aircrew who supported these missions with insertion and extraction flights also performed with extraordinary skill and bravery, flying deliberately into some of the most dangerous airspace in Southeast Asia to support the teams on the ground. The CIA personnel, military intelligence officers, and operational planners who conceived, planned, and coordinated Project Eldest Son, demonstrated considerable creativity, technical competence, and operational sophistication. They identified a genuine vulnerability in enemy operations, specifically the dependence on ammunition supplies that could not be completely secured against infiltration. They developed technical means to exploit that vulnerability through creation of sabotaged ammunition. They created operational procedures and methods to implement the program effectively while maintaining security. They coordinated complex operations involving multiple agencies and military units. These are all indicators of professional competence and effectiveness in the challenging field of covert operations. However, when we shift our assessment from operational execution to strategic impact and effectiveness in achieving larger war objectives, the picture becomes substantially less clear and much more ambiguous. The critical questions that must be asked and answered are whether Project Eldest Son significantly affected the course of the war, whether it meaningfully degraded enemy combat capability in ways that mattered strategically, and whether it contributed in important ways to achieving American strategic objectives in Vietnam. The honest and difficult answer, based on available evidence, is that the strategic impact was modest at best and may have been quite limited. The North Vietnamese continued to fight effectively and aggressively throughout the entire period when Project Eldest Son was active at significant scale. They launched and sustained major military operations, including the Tet Offensive in early 1968, just as the program was becoming fully operational. The Cambodian incursion operations, sustained. Combat in the Central Highlands and other key areas, and eventually the Easter Offensive in 1972, which was a massive conventional invasion using tanks, artillery, and combined arms operations. All of these major operations required absolutely enormous quantities of ammunition, literally millions of rounds, that had to be moved down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and distributed to forces throughout South Vietnam. If Project Eldest Son had been truly effective at disrupting enemy ammunition supplies, or at creating paralyzing fear that prevented effective use of available ammunition, these major operations would not have been possible or would have been significantly degraded in their effectiveness. The enemy logistics system, while certainly strained by American interdiction efforts of all types, including bombing, sensor programs, and sabotage, continued to function adequately to sustain military operations throughout the war. North Vietnamese forces never ran critically short of ammunition in ways that forced them to suspend operations or significantly scale back their activities. Their soldiers, while psychologically affected to some degree by fears about ammunition safety, continued to engage in combat, to attack American and South Vietnamese positions, to hold defensive positions, and generally to perform their military missions. The ammunition sabotage created problems and concerns for them certainly, but it did not break their will to fight or cause fundamental collapse of their combat capability. The direct enemy casualties caused by sabotaged ammunition, while certainly tragic for the individuals killed or wounded and for their families, were statistically quite small in the context of a war that killed millions of Vietnamese and more than 58,000 Americans over more than a decade of intense combat. The most optimistic American estimates during the war suggested casualties in the hundreds from sabotaged ammunition, with some analysts suggesting the number might reach into the low thousands if indirect casualties from fear and hesitation were included. Even accepting the higher estimates, these casualties represented a tiny fraction of 1% of total North Vietnamese military casualties during the war. They were not strategically significant in affecting enemy manpower or capability. The psychological impact of the program was certainly broader and more significant than just the direct physical casualties, and this was always the primary intended effect. Fear about ammunition safety did spread through enemy forces. Time and resources were consumed in testing, inspecting, and implementing security measures. Soldiers were psychologically burdened by concerns about whether their ammunition was safe. But even this psychological impact, while real and measurable through various intelligence indicators, was not decisive in fundamentally degrading enemy combat effectiveness or will to fight. The North Vietnamese adapted their procedures, accepted the additional burden, and continued to function militarily at levels adequate to achieve their strategic objectives. The resources that the United States invested in Project Eldest Son, While perhaps not enormous by the overall standards of the Vietnam War, where hundreds of billions of dollars were spent, were nonetheless substantial and could have been applied to other purposes. The Special Operations personnel and SOG teams that conducted insertion missions represented some of America's most highly trained and capable military assets. The time they spent on Project Eldest Son missions was time they were not available for other high-value missions, including reconnaissance operations that gathered intelligence, prisoner snatch operations that produced immediate interrogation value, or direct action missions against enemy leadership or critical facilities. The intelligence resources devoted to identifying targets, planning operations, and assessing effectiveness could have been directed toward other intelligence priorities. The propaganda and psychological warfare efforts could have supported different themes and campaigns. The fundamental question of whether the actual return on this investment of resources justified the costs and opportunity costs remains legitimately debatable among reasonable analysts who might examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions. Some military analysts and historians have argued that Project Eldest Son's value should be measured not primarily by its direct impact, but rather by the indirect effects of forcing the enemy to divert resources, time, and attention to countermeasures. Every hour North Vietnamese personnel spent testing ammunition was time not spent on other activities. Every soldier pulled from combat operations to guard supply facilities was a soldier not available for the front lines. Every ounce of doubt and hesitation created by fear of sabotaged ammunition potentially affected performance in combat in subtle ways that are impossible to measure, but might nonetheless be real. These opportunity costs imposed on the enemy were part of the program's impact, even though they are inherently difficult to quantify with precision. Others have argued that the program's primary value was not its actual material effects, but rather its demonstration of American capability and willingness to conduct sophisticated unconventional operations deep in enemy rear areas. Project Eldest Son showed concretely that American intelligence and special operations forces could reach into supposedly secure enemy supply systems and corrupt the most essential military supplies. This demonstration of capability may have had deterrent effects, or may have caused enemy planners to worry about what else might be compromised or sabotaged. The psychological impact on enemy leadership and planning, as opposed to the psychological impact on individual soldiers, may have been significant even if difficult to document. The ethical and legal dimensions of Project Eldest Son remain genuinely controversial and contentious even today among military ethicists, international lawyers, and thoughtful observers of warfare. From a legal perspective, under both domestic American law and international humanitarian law, the program operated in a gray area where legitimate arguments could be made on multiple sides. International humanitarian law, particularly as codified in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, places various restrictions on weapons and tactics that can be used in warfare. The fundamental principles that weapons must discriminate between combatants and civilians, must not cause unnecessary suffering beyond what is required for military necessity, and must provide some reasonable ability for potential targets to take protective measures or defend themselves. Sabotaged ammunition could reasonably be argued to violate several of these fundamental principles. It did not effectively discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, since anyone who used the ammunition, whether military personnel or civilians who might somehow acquire it, would be affected. It arguably caused unnecessary suffering, in the sense that soldiers were being killed or maimed by their own weapons, without any ability to defend themselves, or even to know they were in danger until the moment of catastrophic failure. There was no warning or opportunity to avoid the threat, since the ammunition looked completely normal. From this legal and ethical perspective, sabotaged ammunition was analogous to poison weapons or other prohibited means of warfare that the international community had agreed should not be used even in war. The American legal justification for the program, which was apparently accepted by government lawyers who reviewed and approved the operation, was that the ammunition was being inserted specifically and exclusively into military supply caches and would therefore only be used by enemy combatants in combat situations. The soldiers using the sabotaged ammunition were entirely legitimate military targets under the laws of war, who could lawfully be killed by any number of other means, including being shot, bombed, or blown up by mines. Killing them with sabotaged ammunition was simply another method of causing enemy casualties, and the fact that they didn't know about this specific threat in advance didn't make it illegal, since soldiers routinely face many threats they don't know about. Artillery fire can arrive without warning, snipers shoot from concealment, mines detonate unexpectedly. The element of surprise and the inability to defend against all threats is inherent in warfare. This legal justification is defensible under some interpretations of international law, but does not fully address the deeper ethical concerns that many people have about this type of warfare. There is something fundamentally deceptive and, arguably, treacherous about manufacturing weapons or ammunition that appears normal and safe, but is actually designed to kill the user. It violates what might be considered an implicit understanding or norm that soldiers should be able to trust their own equipment, even if they cannot trust anything from the enemy. It introduces an element of betrayal and deception into warfare that crosses lines that many ethicists argue should be respected, even in the morally compromised context of armed conflict. The risk to civilians from sabotaged ammunition was probably relatively small in practice, but was nonetheless real and troubling. The sabotaged ammunition was supposed to be inserted only into military supply chains where only military personnel would have access to it. But in the chaotic and fluid environment of war, especially in a guerrilla war like Vietnam, where the lines between military and civilian spheres were often blurred, maintaining complete separation between military and civilian supplies was essentially impossible. Black markets existed where military supplies were diverted and sold to civilians. Ammunition was sometimes lost or abandoned and could be found by anyone. The possibility that sabotaged ammunition could end up in civilian hands, where it might kill a farmer trying to use it for hunting, or a child who found it and was playing with it, was real, even if the probability was low. The precedent set by Project Eldest Son was also concerning to some policymakers and military lawyers at the time, and has remained a concern for analysts examining the program historically. If the United States could develop and deploy sabotaged ammunition against enemy forces, what would prevent other countries or non-state actors from doing the same thing to American forces or to other targets? What would stop terrorist organizations from adopting similar tactics of sabotaging supplies? Once the principle that sabotaging essential supplies was an acceptable method of warfare was established, where would the limits be drawn? These questions about precedent and the potential for escalation to even more problematic tactics troubled some officials even as they approved the program based on its potential military value. Despite these substantial ethical and legal concerns, no serious legal challenges to Project Eldest Son were ever mounted or seriously pursued. The program remained classified and essentially unknown to the public, to Congress, and to international observers during the war and for decades afterward. By the time significant details emerged into public knowledge in the 1990s and 2000s, there was no practical mechanism or forum for holding anyone accountable, even if violations of law or ethics had occurred. The personnel involved at all levels were acting under orders, following approved procedures, and operating within what they understood to be legal authorities. The officials who authorized and oversaw the program were acting within their understanding of legal constraints and authorities, as advised by government lawyers. The window for any kind of accountability had long since closed. The influence of Project Eldest Son on subsequent special operations doctrine, practices, and capabilities was significant, though often difficult to trace directly, because so much remains classified even today. The techniques and methods developed for infiltrating enemy rear areas to conduct sabotage operations against supply lines became part of the repertoire and toolkit of American Special Operations Forces. The concept of attacking enemy logistics not just through traditional means like bombing and interdiction, but through corruption and sabotage of supplies became incorporated into operational planning for potential future conflicts. The integration of technical sabotage with psychological warfare and propaganda campaigns to amplify effects became a model for information operations and psychological operations. The detailed lessons learned about operational security, about maintaining technical security of sabotage methods and preventing enemy discovery and countermeasures, about coordinating complex operations involving multiple agencies and military units, about assessing effectiveness of covert operations. All of these became part of the institutional knowledge and expertise of special operations and intelligence communities. Many of the personnel who worked on Project Eldest Son at various levels went on to senior positions in special operations commands, in intelligence agencies, and in policy positions where they were able to apply the lessons from this program to new situations, challenges, and opportunities. There have been various reports over the years, impossible to fully confirm or deny because of classification issues, that similar ammunition sabotage programs or related sabotage operations were considered, planned, or even implemented in conflicts after Vietnam. The basic concept remains attractive from a military planning perspective because it offers the potential to leverage relatively small investments of special operations capabilities to create disproportionate psychological effects on enemy forces. Whether such programs were actually executed in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, or other conflict zones, and if so, with what methods and results, remains unknown to the public and will likely remain classified for many more years. The psychological warfare lessons and principles from Project Eldest Son were extensively studied and incorporated into military doctrine for information operations and psychological operations. The program demonstrated concretely and convincingly that creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt could be as militarily valuable as direct destruction of enemy capabilities in degrading overall effectiveness. The integration of physical effects, in this case the actual weapons explosions, with information operations and propaganda to amplify the psychological impact, became a model that has been applied in various forms to numerous subsequent operations. Modern information warfare, cyber operations, and psychological operations apply similar underlying principles in different technological and operational contexts. Just as Project Eldest Son made enemy soldiers doubt their ammunition, modern operations might aim to make adversaries doubt their information systems, their communication security, their intelligence, or their command and control. For the individual men who participated in Project Eldest Son at various levels and in various roles, the legacy has been deeply personal, complex, and in many cases difficult to process psychologically and morally. The Special Operations Forces, primarily SOG team members who conducted the dangerous insertion operations, added these missions to their accumulation of intense and traumatic combat experiences. Some felt and continue to feel pride in having conducted extraordinarily difficult and dangerous operations successfully against a determined enemy under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Others have been troubled over the years by the nature of what they were doing, essentially creating sophisticated booby traps designed to kill enemy soldiers through deception and betrayal of their trust. Most have simply incorporated these missions into their overall experience of service in Vietnam, viewing them as one more set of missions they were ordered to conduct because it was their duty, without dwelling excessively on the moral dimensions. The years and decades after the war have been psychologically difficult for many SOG veterans who participated in these and other classified missions. They conducted the most dangerous missions of the entire war in highly classified programs, about which they could not speak for many years. They received no public recognition or acknowledgement for their service and sacrifices. Many struggled severely with post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychological effects of intense sustained combat. When they were finally able years or decades later to discuss some of their experiences as information was gradually declassified, much of the American public was uninterested in hearing more Vietnam War stories. Some veterans felt that their extraordinary sacrifices and the sacrifices of friends who died were unappreciated and unacknowledged by the country they had served. As Special Operations Forces history, and specifically SOG history, has gradually been declassified and written about in books and documentaries, SOG veterans have gained some measure of the recognition they deserved for their service. Veterans organizations and reunions have allowed them to reconnect with fellow team members and to share experiences with people who understand what they went through. The formation of support networks has provided psychological and practical assistance. Some veterans have found a degree of healing and peace through being able to finally tell their stories and have them heard and acknowledged. But for others, the psychological wounds remain difficult, and the questions about whether their sacrifices served worthwhile purposes remain unresolved. For the technical personnel, engineers, and scientists who worked on developing and manufacturing the sabotaged ammunition, the legacy has also been complex and morally ambiguous. They applied their considerable expertise and technical skills to creating weapons designed to kill through deception and betrayal. Some felt and feel pride in the technical achievements and in having contributed their skills to what they understood as the war effort and their country's interests. Others have been troubled over the years by having designed and built what were essentially sophisticated instruments of death in such a calculated and cold-blooded manner. The moral ambiguity of creating ammunition that looked safe but was deadly, of deliberately manufacturing items that would betray the trust of the people using them, has stayed with some participants throughout their lives. The CIA personnel, military intelligence officers, and operational planners who conceived, designed, and managed Project Eldest Son generally viewed it through the lens of covert operations professionals for whom moral ambiguities is inherent in the work. In the pragmatic and often immoral calculus of intelligence operations, where success is typically measured purely by whether operational objectives were achieved within acceptable costs and risks, Project Eldest Son was largely successful. It operated essentially as designed, created intended effects on enemy forces, and maintained its security throughout its operational life. By these professional standards and metrics, it was a well-conceived and well-executed covert operation, regardless of any larger questions about strategic impact or ethical concerns. The North Vietnamese perspective on Project Eldest Son and its effects has been much less documented and is more difficult to assess with confidence. The Vietnamese government has never officially acknowledged the program in any detail or discussed its impact extensively in official histories or publications. References in Vietnamese military historical writings are typically vague and brief when they exist at all. Former North Vietnamese soldiers who have written memoirs or given interviews to historians occasionally mention fears about sabotaged ammunition or describe specific incidents of weapons exploding, but rarely provide extensive analysis or reflection on the program's overall impact on their forces or their thinking. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that North Vietnamese forces, with characteristic resilience and determination, overcame the challenges posed by Project Eldest Son, just as they overcame countless other challenges and obstacles during their long struggle. They adapted their procedures and tactics, implemented countermeasures that were at least partially effective, accepted the casualties as an unfortunate but bearable cost of war, and continued fighting until they ultimately achieved their strategic objective of reunifying Vietnam under communist control. From their perspective, Project Eldest Son was one more American tactic among many, more sophisticated and insidious than most, perhaps, but ultimately one that failed to break their will or prevent their victory. For military historians and analysts studying the Vietnam War, Project Eldest Son provides a genuinely fascinating and instructive case study in unconventional warfare, psychological operations, and the complex relationship between tactical innovation and strategic effectiveness. It demonstrates both the potential and the significant limitations of technological and operational sophistication. American forces developed and deployed a genuinely innovative capability that had never been attempted on this scale before. They executed complex operations with considerable skill. They achieved measurable tactical and operational effects. And yet these achievements did not translate into strategic success or into meaningful progress toward winning the war. The program illustrates vividly how even technologically advanced adversaries can adapt to new threats and develop countermeasures that limit effectiveness. The North Vietnamese studied the problem, understood what was happening, and developed responses that, while not completely eliminating the threat, reduced its impact to manageable levels. This adaptability and resilience in the face of technological challenges is a recurring theme in military history and remains highly relevant to contemporary conflicts. Project Eldest Son also raises enduring and important questions about how to assess effectiveness in unconventional warfare, psychological operations, and covert action. Traditional military metrics like territory controlled, enemy casualties inflicted, or weapons destroyed don't fully capture the impact of operations designed primarily to create psychological effects like fear, uncertainty, and doubt. How do you measure psychological impact with any precision? How do you know whether resources invested in psychological operations would have produced better results if applied to other approaches. These methodological and assessment challenges that vexed analysts during the Vietnam War remain challenging today and will likely remain challenging for the foreseeable future. The story of Project Eldest Son reminds us that wars are fought as much in the human psychological domain as in the physical domain. The fear in a soldier's mind when loading his weapon, the doubt about whether ammunition can be trusted, the hesitation before pulling the trigger based on worry about whether the gun will fire normally or explode. These psychological factors directly and immediately affect combat effectiveness just as surely as the physical characteristics of weapons in the tactical situation. Understanding and exploiting the psychological dimension has always been part of warfare, but modern capabilities and sophisticated understanding of psychology make psychological operations potentially more impactful than ever before, while also raising serious ethical questions about manipulation and about appropriate limits even in war. Project Eldest Son also stands as a powerful reminder that warfare constantly evolves through cycles of innovation and adaptation. One side develops new tactics, techniques, or technologies to gain advantage. The other side studies the innovation, develops countermeasures, and adapts their own operations. The cycle continues indefinitely, with neither side able to achieve permanent advantage. What seems like a war-winning innovation at one moment can be overcome by determined adversaries who refuse to be defeated. This fundamental dynamic means that lessons from historical programs must be applied thoughtfully and carefully to new situations, rather than assuming that what worked once will work again in different circumstances. As we look back now on Project Eldest Son, more than half a century after its execution during the height of American involvement in Vietnam, we can appreciate multiple dimensions of this complex operation simultaneously. We can acknowledge and respect the technical innovation that went into creating the sabotaged ammunition and the sophisticated operational methods for deploying it. We can honor the extraordinary operational courage of the Special Operations Forces who conducted the dangerous insertion missions and the pilots who supported them. We can recognize the psychological sophistication of the propaganda campaigns designed to amplify effects. We can appreciate the professional competence of the intelligence officers and planners who conceived and managed the program. At the same time, we can and must honestly acknowledge the program's limitations and its troubling ethical dimensions. The strategic impact was modest at best. The ethical questions about methods that relied fundamentally on deception and betrayal remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. The precedent set raises concerns about future conflicts. The risk to civilians, while probably small, was nonetheless real. These critical observations don't negate the courage and professionalism of the individuals involved, but they do require us to think carefully about what tactics and methods should be employed, even in the difficult circumstances of war. The men and women who worked on Project Eldest Son at every level, from the engineers who designed the sabotaged ammunition in laboratories and manufacturing facilities in the United States, to the planners who identified targets and coordinated operations from intelligence centers, to the Special Operations Forces who conducted the incredibly dangerous insertion missions deep in enemy territory, to the analysts who assessed effects and tried to measure impact, all contributed to a significant covert operation that pushed boundaries of what had been attempted previously. Their work, their courage, and their sacrifices deserve to be remembered, understood, and studied as an important part of the broader history of American involvement in Vietnam and of the evolution of special operations and covert action. The ethical questions raised by Project Eldest Son remain genuinely unresolved and will likely remain subjects of legitimate disagreement among thoughtful people. Was it ethical and appropriate to sabotage enemy ammunition in this way? Did the operation cross moral and legal lines that should be respected even in the context of war? Did the potential military benefits justify the methods employed and the risks created? These are not questions with simple or obvious answers. They require carefully weighing competing values, principles, and considerations. Different people, all acting in good faith and with full knowledge of the facts, can and do reach different conclusions based on how they weigh and prioritize various moral and legal principles. What we can state with confidence and clarity is that Project Eldest Son was a significant and substantial covert operation that had real measurable effects on enemy forces, that involved remarkable technical achievement and extraordinary operational courage that raised important and enduring ethical and legal questions that remain relevant today, and that influenced subsequent thinking about unconventional warfare, special operations, and psychological operations in ways that continue to shape how militaries operate. It represents a fascinating and important chapter in the history of the Vietnam War, in the history of American intelligence and special operations, and in the broader evolution of modern warfare. The ammunition that was sabotaged during Project Eldest Son is long gone now, either fired and exploded decades ago, or degraded by time and tropical conditions into useless corroded remnants. The soldiers who were killed by exploding weapons have been dead for more than 50 years, their families still carrying the grief of those losses. The fear and uncertainty created by the program among enemy forces has faded from living memory, as veterans from all sides age and pass away. Most of the classified documents describing the program in complete detail remain restricted even now under classification rules. The program itself has become history, studied by researchers and historians, but no longer part of active military operations. Yet the fundamental questions that Project Eldest Son raised and the lessons it taught remain genuinely relevant and important in our contemporary world. We live in an era of sophisticated cyber warfare where adversaries can potentially corrupt computer systems and networks in ways that users cannot detect. We face information operations designed to create doubt and uncertainty about what information can be trusted. We see psychological warfare and influence operations conducted at scales and with sophistication that would have been impossible in the 1960s. Understanding the historical experience with programs like Project Eldest Son, understanding both what worked and what didn't work, understanding both the potential and the limitations and the ethical challenges, helps us navigate these contemporary challenges more thoughtfully and effectively. The fundamental dynamics of trying to create advantage through deception, of exploiting enemy vulnerabilities in creative ways, of using psychology as a weapon, of weighing operational effectiveness against ethical constraints. These dynamics remain constant, even as the specific methods and technologies evolve dramatically. The questions about what tactics and methods are appropriate even in war, about where lines should be drawn, even when fighting enemies who may not respect any limits, about how to balance military necessity against humanitarian principles. These questions that Project Eldest Son raised remain as urgent and difficult today as they were 50 years ago. Project Eldest Son deserves to be remembered, studied, and understood not merely as an obscure footnote in the vast history of the Vietnam War, but as a significant case study that illuminates important truths about unconventional warfare, about the relationship between tactical innovation and strategic effectiveness, about the power and limitations of psychological operations, about the ethical complexities inherent in covert action, and about the enduring truth that wars are ultimately won or lost by human beings whose psychology, morale, and will to continue fighting matter as much as any physical capabilities or resources. More than 50 years have passed since the last sabotage cartridge was inserted into an enemy ammunition cache along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The men who planned Project Eldest Son are mostly gone now, taking their detailed knowledge of classified operations to their graves. The special operations soldiers who risked everything on those insertion missions are aging, their numbers diminishing each year. The North Vietnamese soldiers who survived weapons explosions, who felt the terror of not knowing which bullet might kill them, are also passing into history. The physical evidence has long since disappeared, corroded into rust and dust in the Laotian jungle. But the questions that Project Eldest Son raised refuse to fade as easily as the evidence. In military academies and special operations courses around the world, the program is still studied as a case study in unconventional warfare. Intelligence analysts still debate whether the results justified the risks and costs. Military ethicists still argue about whether sabotaging ammunition crosses lines that should be respected even in war. These debates continue because the underlying issues remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Project Eldest Son revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare that remains relevant today. Technology and innovation can create tactical advantages, can impose costs on enemies, can achieve effects that would be impossible through conventional means. But technological sophistication alone cannot overcome determined adversaries who refuse to be broken, who adapt and endure, who are willing to accept losses and continue fighting. The North Vietnamese took casualties from exploding weapons, implemented countermeasures, and kept fighting until they won. No amount of clever sabotage could substitute for the strategic and political failures that ultimately led to American defeat. The program also demonstrated that, in warfare, trust itself can become a casualty. When soldiers cannot trust their own ammunition, when every bullet becomes potentially deadly to the person firing it rather than to the enemy, something fundamental breaks in the psychology of combat. Project Eldest Son weaponized that betrayal of trust deliberately and systematically. Whether that was justified, whether it was ethical, whether it was wise, these questions have no easy answers. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about what we are willing to do to enemies and what kind of precedents we are willing to set. For the veterans who participated in Project Eldest Son, the program represents something deeply personal that goes beyond strategic assessments or ethical debates. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, who were asked to conduct extraordinarily dangerous missions or to create weapons of deception. They did what their country asked of them, under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Some came home with bodies intact, but minds scarred by what they had experienced and what they had done. Others never came home at all, dying in jungles whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce, in support of operations the public knew nothing about. The sabotaged ammunition that was the physical manifestation of Project Eldest Son has vanished. But its echo continues. Every time military planners consider how to exploit enemy vulnerabilities through unconventional means, the lessons of Project Eldest Son inform their thinking. Every time ethicists debate the boundaries of acceptable conduct in war, Project Eldest Son provides a case study in crossing into morally ambiguous territory. Every time special operations forces plan missions behind enemy lines, they draw on doctrine and techniques that were developed or refined during those dangerous insertion operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Project Eldest Son was the CIA's deadliest booby trap operation, a program that turned enemy ammunition into instruments of death through technical brilliance and operational daring. It killed enemy soldiers, created fear and uncertainty, demonstrated American reach into supposedly secure rear areas, and pushed the boundaries of psychological warfare. It also raised profound questions about means and ends, about the ethics of deception in warfare, about the relationship between tactical success and strategic failure. These questions outlived the program itself and remain with us today, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, a permanent legacy of an operation that has passed into history but refuses to be forgotten. The rifles stopped exploding decades ago, but the lessons and the questions endure, waiting for the next generation of warriors, planners, and citizens to grapple with the same difficult choices about what we are willing to do in the name of security, and what lines we must not cross even when fighting enemies who recognize no limits. Project Eldest Son teaches us that in war, the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that can be seen, and that the most lasting damage is not always measured in casualties. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we inflict on our own principles and on our own understanding of who we are and what we stand for. That is the true legacy of the exploding ammunition, the echo that will not fade, the question that will not be silenced.